Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Had a Harem with Kacchako? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Damn it. You stupid round-faced F-. Wake up. Bakugo shouted, his voice cracking halfway through the sentence. He coughed as dust filled his lungs, drying his mouth out, and grunted as the movement sent pain lancing through his back. There was a gigantic slab of concrete forcing his spine into a sharp, perfect line. He supported it, although it felt like it was driving him into the ground. Below him, Uraraka bled faintly from the corner of her mouth, and a bruise was just barely visible at the crown of her head. Bakugo could feel her breathing against his chest, the rise and fall of her body gently brushing his own. It was so quiet. "Come on, Uraraka," Bakugo whispered, dropping his head to her chest and squeezing his eyes shut. "Wake up." Uraraka didn't. Several weeks previous. It started at a formal gala. Suit and tie, fancy gowns and sparkly dresses. The whole 9 yards. Bakugo didn't wear ties. He hadn't been able to tie one on since middle school, with the slime monster villain. Anything around his neck like that made him feel constricted and overwhelmed. Nobody knew that. The paparazzi didn't deserve to know that. "Can you at least let me get inside before you start harassing me?" he snarled, stomping past flashing cameras. Behind him, Kirishima was pulled aside for a personal interview. Red Riot was always featured in newsreels. He was charming and always willing to talk. Bakugo, less so. Ground Zero. Ground Zero. Are you going to continue to develop your bad boy image by ignoring set dress codes? No comment. Bakugo managed to just bite back the snarl of "Liu" that tried to escape. Being a pro-hero had rules, after all, and nobody would support a new hero like him if he attacked the press every time they annoyed him. No matter how badly he wanted to, even after 2 years. He made it through the crowds of press and into the gigantic building they were using to host the gala tonight. It was a huge thing, and almost 400 heroes were gathered on its grounds tonight to raise money for the charity fund that helped underprivileged kids attend hero academies, like UA. Some of his classmates hadn't gone into the hero business. He didn't get it. All that work, and quit at the finish line? Idiotic. He saw a few of the ones that had made it Kaminari and Mina dancing around the room. They were good friends still, and Bakugo was pretty sure they were part of the same agency. Across the room he saw Ida talking with reporters, his arms in perfect 90-degree angles. They had all entered the hero industry running and ready. So had a few more besides the obvious, but Bakugo didn't see Siro, Azui, or anyone else anywhere. The one with the weird ears, Jiru, he pretended not to know, had instead started producing music. She had some deal currently with Present Mix Station. Really, the only reason Bakugo knew that was because Kirishima had her on the radio in their shared apartment all the time. She wasn't a full-time hero. So, Bakugo reasoned, it was weird that she was here. And in a suit? Bakugo almost asked Kirishima about it, hesitating only because he wasn't sure why he even cared, but then a voice rang out clearly, cutting across chatter, from his left. "Kakken." For F's sake. He ground his teeth, ignoring the protest of his jaw, and faced Deku. Kirishima clapped him on his shoulder when his first reaction wasn't a shout. Midoriya was in a pastel blue suit with a ruffled collar that definitely hadn't ever been fashionable, "Thank you very much," and Bakugo very maturely didn't comment on it. "You look like a effendi child." Kirishima sighed. Midoriya straightened his lapels, and Bakugo realized that he had 2 All Might pins as his cufflinks. "What FING nerd. You look great. It's been a while, Kakken. How are you doing?" "Fine. Did you think I wouldn't be?" Midoriya didn't. Kirishima tried. "No, of course not." Midoriya flailed his hands. "Hey guys. Oh wow, it's like a class reunion." Uraraka was suddenly there, pastel orange dress swishing over Bakugo's boots with how close she got to the group. She had her hair in some twisty style, and from her ears hung earrings that looked like fireworks. They sparkled. Bakugo frowned at them, not sure why they'd caught his attention, and tuned back into the conversation in time to see Uraraka burst into laughter as Midoriya, who was 19 goddamn years old, cover his face as he turned bright red. He scoffed and stuffed his hands into his pockets. "You too effing yet?" Uraraka squeaked, covering her mouth in shock, and Deku looked like he was choking on his own tongue. Bakugo smirked. "Oh my god, Bakugo, you can't say things like that." "Why not?" He shrugged, not caring, and Uraraka rolled her eyes at him, the normal color returning to her face. "Whatever." She sighed. "If you actually paid attention, you'd know Deku is with Todoroki-kun now." "No way." "Finally, a man." Kirishima looked proud, hugging Deku tightly enough to lift him off the ground. "What?" Bakugo sputtered, bewildered. He never noticed. "But don't feel bad, I don't think he knows Jairu and Yamamo are dating either," Kirishima said, winking, and Bakugo whipped his head around, scanning the ballroom again and indeed finding Jairu and Yaoyorozu holding hands while they talked. "What the F dash? I always thought you were observant, Kakken." Deku chuckled and Bakugo's fingers sparked. It was always such a good thing his mother custom made his clothes. "Whatever." He was interrupted when Endeavor made the microphone screech through the entire building in a valiant attempt to give a speech. Several people clapped their hands to their ears until the noise passed. Present Mike appeared, quickly remedying the situation and giving the microphone back to the #1 hero. Hello." He began, and then started talking. In the last 4-ish years, Endeavor hadn't gotten much better at the PR aspects of being a hero. But apparently he'd gotten better in other areas. As if he hadn't, Todoroki appeared beside the group. Bakugo was really trying to lose in the crowd and spent the majority of his father's speech making faces, until Deku was giggling so hard he couldn't drink the champagne someone brought him. "I didn't know Deku was gay either until they got together," Uraraka whispered, and Bakugo shot her a dark look. Her eyes had smudges of color around them. It looked weird. "He's bi," Bakugo muttered, looking away. "And you didn't know because you were too busy trying to get in his breathes." "That's not true," Uraraka said, and when he went to send her another glare she laughed, right in his face. "I was trying to get him in my breathes." Puff pink cheeks. Uraraka beamed at him and didn't move. Kirishima was on his other side. The speech was still going on. God, he had never hated charity before, but this was looking like the one that did him in. He almost regretted his phrasing of that thought when the ceiling suddenly rained glass as the windows above them shattered. A body fell through the air, and all around him heroes new and old readied themselves for a fight. Beside him, Kirishima's skin turned solid and rocky. Uraraka's fingers spread. Bakugo didn't move. He wasn't sure why he of all people recognized what it was. But he did. And his hands didn't go up in defense. He aimed his palms down immediately, already thinking he was the worst one for what he was about to do as he launched himself into the air. Uraraka's skirt smoldered as it got caught in the blast, and Kirishima cried out in alarm. He reached out and caught the intruder with one arm, slowing his descent carefully with a blast only slightly aimed at people. His boots made a loud noise, glass cracking under them as he landed. He dropped the body in his arms to the ground, and only then did he still, going silent. It was a corpse. He'd known that much when he'd seen it falling. He just hadn't expected to recognize the face. He didn't know her name. Why did he never learn anyone's stupid names? Shiafianji built his Dmed gauntlets and he didn't know her name? He felt horrible. He stared at her face, at her pink hair, at her jarring eyes. Hatsum-chan, someone from the crowd sounded heartbroken. The emotion felt too loud and personal in the silence that had fallen as Bakugo caught her. All around, people his age were staring. Everyone had known her. She made half of them into who they were able to be. Bakugo said, stepping back as someone rushed forward to check on the body. He shook his head, trying to shake the image of her sightless eyes staring at him. He snapped back into hero mode immediately, noticing others around him doing the same. Endeavor was gone from the stage, and most of the senior pro heroes had vanished alongside him. No doubt they were going to investigate the rooftop and outside. Bakugo moved to make eye contact with Kirishima, but found brown eyes meeting his instead of red. Round cheeks. Uraraka held out her hand. He stepped closer and touched his hand to hers without hesitation. The first time they'd done this had been in the middle of a training battle, their second year. He'd been gunning for Deku as usual, and she'd slipped under his guard and slapped his butt of all things. The explosion that should have sent him rocketing into Deku sent him hurtling way too fast, not only into Deku, but through 4 walls. After that, they'd played with it a little. It wasn't the first time Bakugo had been impressed with Uraraka. But it was the first he'd said so. They immediately began to float. A few heads turned to look at them, but Ida began to herd everyone to investigate the grounds. 400 heroes, and they all turned into idiots around one another, it seemed. Bakugo saw Todoroki on the phone. He couldn't see Deku. He wondered where the idiot had run off to, but then Uraraka tugged on his belt. Bakugo looked up again as they grew closer to the glass. Then he frowned. Wait a second. It looks wrong, doesn't it? Uraraka said, squinting. She pointed off to the right of the broken skylight. Take us over there? Bakugo put his hand behind his back and made the tiniest explosion he could manage. They still zoomed towards where she'd pointed much faster than intended. Bakugo had to constantly move his hand, little explosions going off to keep them in place. The cuffs of his suit were going to be scorched to hell. Someone effing wrote on the ceiling? What the hell does it say? He grunted, a little too focused on keeping them away from the spikes of glass to read the small words scrawled in the stone. It's chiseled out, like someone had a knife or claw, Uraraka said, and Bakugo grunted again. Get on with it, damn it. It's like a fraction. 1 over a question mark. Uraraka shifted her weight slightly, and Bakugo managed to get a quick glimpse of what she was talking about. 1/? Who's next? If they don't catch whoever did this, it's gonna turn into a FING serial killing. Bakugo grit his teeth. Let's go up through the roof. Endeavor is probably up there. I think I saw Hawks grab him. Uraraka nodded. Then, without him needing to ask, she released her quirk to send them falling quickly towards the floor. She activated again, and he positioned them just right with a few quick explosions, careful to keep one hand on her so they wouldn't get separated. They floated up through the hole in the ceiling, and he pushed them to the side so they landed on the roof. What are you kids doing out here? Endeavor demanded, go back inside. The other heroes are making sure the inside is secure, sir. We found information that's helpful. Uraraka said, speaking almost on top of Endeavor to make sure Bakugo didn't get a chance to talk. If Ground Zero and Endeavor started bickering, it was never going to end. As Uraraka rattled off a report of what they found, Bakugo moved over to the edge of the room, peering over. Below him, Kirishima was holding a door open as heroes poured out of the building and into the grass. Hawks was circling the building, looking for anything suspicious. His wings were a bright spot against the night sky. He gave Bakugo a nod of acknowledgement, but didn't stop moving. So there's someone threatening us. Here, tonight. Endeavor scowled into the distance. But why? Another Stain cult? Hawks asked, landing right beside Endeavor and seemingly oblivious to the flames. Hatsum wasn't a hero, though. If they're trying to be like Stain, like the League of Villains sort of claimed, then wouldn't they, Uraraka said, tapping her lips in thought. Bakugo wondered if she'd gotten that from Deku. She never got to finish her sentence, because a blast of freezing air came up from inside the building. Endeavor's eyes went wide. Was that Todoroki? Uraraka said, already at the edge of the hole. Ground Zero, come on. Bakugo made it to the skylight as she jumped in, only a half step behind her. They both caught themselves with their quirks before they hit the ground and stopped. Get out of here, and take as many people as you can. Shoto said, glancing over his shoulder for barely a second. He was busy making the biggest and thickest ice wall any of them had ever seen, accompanied by a tiny girl with scales on her face and a water quirk, and a few other ice users. Deku says there's a bomb downstairs. Then why the F are you building a wall? They need to defuse it, you the idiot. Bakugo snarled, a cold fear settling in his stomach. It's on a timer, and there's less than 2 minutes left. Shoto barked back. Most of the other heroes have escaped. Do a sweep and make sure. Uraraka didn't need to be told twice. She sprinted past, barreling down an unblocked hallway. Bakugo took another, and found a few young heroes investigating a room. Everyone get out. There's a bomb. Unsurprisingly, they didn't need to be told twice. They fled the room, and Bakugo checked another one before the whole building shook. A vase full of pink daisies fell off the counter and landed on the floor, shattering. Paintings fell off the walls. The entire house felt like it was vibrating for just a second, and then it stopped. The house remained standing. Bakugo trekked back into the entrance hall, spotting a few heroes along the way that looked shaken, but not hurt. It didn't make sense. If the bomb wasn't even big enough to bring down the house, what was it for? Emergency services are on their way. Someone told him. He wasn't sure why they told him, but he nodded. He approached Todoroki. The other man had his hands up. There was just a hint of frost covering half his face, and his breath puffed out before him. He gave Bakugo an exhausted look. Need help, Icy Hot? Todoroki rolled his eyes towards him, tilting his head. It is a lot. Bakugo nodded. He couldn't help but think that Todoroki was probably the only reason this building was still standing. He carefully removed his suit jacket before tossing it on the floor behind him, and set about blasting away large chunks of the ice wall. Todoroki followed him with quick bursts of flame, and together they worked to dismantle the wall. Uraraka appeared moments later, out of breath and looking faintly green like she sometimes did when she overused her powers. Bakugo found himself wanting to ask, but didn't. He wasn't sure why. He blasted a much larger chunk of ice, and Todoroki melted the rest of it away. Uraraka stood by, not really having a way to help. Has anyone seen Deku? She asked, sounding concerned. I saw him briefly before the explosion. He ran out a window. I thought he had someone with him, but I'm not sure. Todoroki said, a tightness to his voice that Bakugo had thought was strain from using his quirk so hard so fast. Now he wasn't sure. Strain and concern apparently sounded a lot alike. I'm going to look for him, Uraraka said. Text me if you find him before me, okay? Bakugo went to say that he didn't have her number, but Todoroki nodded and so she was gone. So, Deku? Really? Bakugo asked between explosions. Don't. Todoroki said, and it sounded both like a warning and an exasperated sigh. His flames felt a little hotter as he side-eyed Bakugo with a dry look. You, Bakugo muttered, I was just making conversation. Todoroki actually chuckled at that. They worked in silence after that, except for the loud noises of Bakugo's explosions, and within 15 minutes had the wall down to where they could see over it. The other side of the house was worse off, to be sure, but still not nearly as bad as Bakugo expected. Every picture had fallen off the wall, and every vase or fancy chandelier was shattered completely. All the windows had broken, either from heroes jumping out of them to escape or the explosion itself. But still, the damage was minimal, especially for a bomb that was planted underneath such a fancy building. Had one of the heroes done something? Made a bubble around the detonation zone? Gotten it away? Bakugo frowned. Something's weird. Before Todoroki could respond, Deku arrived. His suit was scorched along the back, but it didn't seem to have eaten through his dress shirt underneath. His slacks were also ruined, shredded until they ended at the knee with nothing but scraggly threads below. He was sweating, and his eyes had the wild look to them they sometimes got after a particularly dangerous rescue mission. Nobody died, he said, sounding relieved. I've checked. Everyone on the guest list has been accounted for. Except you two, obviously, but I told them where you were. He rubbed a hand over his face, pushing his hair back. What the hell happened? Bakugo asked, pretending not to notice the way Todoroki twitched towards Deku like he wanted to embrace him. There was a bomb. Deku said, looking very grave as his eyebrows came down low over his bright green eyes. I found it right at the bottom of the stairs to the basement. The door was locked, but I broke it down because I heard crying. There was someone with the bomb? Todoroki asked, leaning forward without even seeming to notice. Yeah. 2 people, actually. They were just some girls that said they'd been walking around the area. Next thing they knew, they were tied together and tied to a bomb. Deku rubbed his eyes again, sweat irritating him. I managed to get them out, but only barely. I was scared the bomb would be more dangerous. It wasn't for everyone? Bakugo frowned. Someone made a bomb, just to kill 2 random girls? Deku shook his head. It sounds wrong, I know. The girls are probably going to be grilled a little more by the detective agency. But I left before then, He trailed off, gazing at Todoroki and turning slightly pink. I wanted to check on the extent of the damages. It burned up your suit jacket, Todoroki said. You must have been close if it wasn't very damaging. Ugh. Bakugo grunted. Gross. I'm gonna leave before you guys start eye-fucking for real. Deku jerked as though struck. Oh. No, I mean, he fumbled, the light color in his cheeks turning decidedly darker. Kakken, wait. Bakugo had grown a lot over the course of high school, and even more after 2 years of being a hero. That didn't mean he didn't think about ignoring his childhood friend. He managed to stop, but only barely, glancing over his shoulder with a scowl. What, shitty Deku? The detectives want to talk to you. Deku said, because you caught the body. As he said it, Deku seemed to remember whose corpse it was that Bakugo had caught out of a freefall. His eyes went wide and he went completely still. Oh God, Hatsum-sen. As tears began welling in his eyes, Bakugo left the room. Behind him, he heard Todoroki's deep voice murmur words he couldn't make out. He left them to it. I'm effing telling you, she was dead before I ever touched her. I don't know why the hell you keep goddamn asking me this shit. Bakugo roared, slamming his hands down on the table. I'm getting effing sick of you accusing me of killing a girl I grew up with. Nobody is accusing you of anything, Ground Zero. Tsuragami said, already used to Bakugo's explosive temper. We just need all the details we can get. I don't know shit. Bakugo said, except that someone killed her, threw her through the stupid skylight, wrote a bunch of shit on the wall, and then strapped 2 random civilians to a bomb. Tsuragami said, a small bark escaping him as he thought. Bakugo really didn't like this guy. Very well. You're dismissed. Finally, Bakugo snarled, shoving his chair away with such force it toppled over. He'd been trapped at the police station for almost 3 hours. They'd been investigating, interviewing random heroes, whatever it was detectives did, and had only just made time for Bakugo's interview about an hour ago. And then they'd done nothing but demand to know if Hatsum-me was alive before he caught her. As if he'd somehow been the cause of her death. Bakugo ripped his cell phone from his pocket, snarling when he realized it had died at some point. The hell, wonderful. He stomped out of the hallway and towards the main entrance. Oh! Someone he'd shoved said, and he paused at the voice. What are you still doing here, pink cheeks? He asked, slightly less harsh than he'd been. Besides getting in my way. She held out a cup. Serves. A fancy lot, with cinnamon dashed across the top. His favorite drink? What? I texted Mina, and she knew what you liked. Uraraka said, and he nodded, warily taking it from her. Everyone else we know left already. I waited for you. Why? He demanded, sipping the drink. Almost immediately, the familiarity of it made him relax just a little, his shoulders dropping from his ears. Thank you for the drink. But why the hell did you stay behind? I didn't want to walk home alone. Uraraka said, ever the honest one. Her eyes seemed a bit red. Bakugo pretended not to notice. One of her earrings was swinging, from when she tilted her head. It caught the light and flickered, like a firework. Why the f not? Bakugo demanded again, to her statement. You're just as capable as any of the fuckwits there tonight. You don't need a chaperone. Uraraka shrugged, chewing on her lip. Maybe I wanted one anyways. She hesitated and then sighed. I was going to walk home with Deku and Todoroki, but they're gross. Bakugo said in agreement. Uraraka hummed, but didn't look like she disagreed. They were a new couple, it was probably hard not to be gross. FNG fine. I'll walk you home. We'll walk each other home. Uraraka said. Looked up at him, and he found himself staring. Her dress had scorch marks down one side. From him. And she'd ripped it. He cleared his throat and moved towards the door, taking another sip of cinnamon and spice and not waiting for her to say she was ready. She caught up easily, and they stepped into the cool night air together. The walk was easy. So easy. He was surprised. He expected her to chatter away like Deku, or lecture him and gesture wildly like Ida. They were close friends, after all. It only made sense for them to all be alike. But she was mostly quiet. Comfortably quiet. Hatsum made my bracelets. And my belt. They helped with my nausea. She said suddenly, and like that the comfortable silence was shattered. She blinked owlishly as though unsure why she'd said that. Bakugo looked at her warily. Was she about to start crying? I never liked her though. No, I shouldn't have said that. Uraraka covered her mouth and looked around, as though she expected someone to come out and scold her. As it was, Bakugo just snorted. You're effing blunt, he said, and then for some reason he didn't understand. Why not? What? Uraraka turned her wide eyes on him, and Bakugo hurriedly looked away. Why didn't you like her? She flirted with my friends. A lot. Uraraka sighed. She never really seemed to even notice me. I hated how nobody would pay attention to me around Ida-kun and Deku. Bakugo snorted. Plenty of people paid attention to you, he muttered. You were just too busy looking up at those two FNG nerds to notice. Uraraka slowed to a stop. Bakugo frowned, gut clenching as he began wondering if he'd said something weird. He didn't talk to many people. Really, he only talked to Kirishima and occasionally Kaminari, but she was smiling at him. He stared. This is my apartment. She said, oh. Bakugo said, good. Her smile turned a little teasing. He found he liked it. Then he quickly dismissed that thought. If you ever need to visit, I live in 221. She said, second floor at the very end by the stairs. Why would I need to visit you? Bakugo sneered dismissively. Uraraka tilted her head, studying him. Lots of reasons, she said finally, but she made your gauntlets too. Bakugo tensed in surprise, about to give her some snappy comeback, but she was already moving up the stairs to the front door. FNG go to sleep, he said, which didn't make much sense, but for some reason the words had come out of his mouth. You too, Uraraka said with a snort, shutting the door. Bakugo walked another block to his own apartment and opened the door. Kirishima was cooking at the stove, despite how late it was. He glanced back and gave Bakugo a nod. Bakugo moved through the kitchen to their bathroom. He showered quickly, scrubbing his hands through his hair, then scrubbing his arms until they were red. Then he washed his hands and his hands and his hands. He couldn't get the Hatsume's body had looked in his hands out of his head. He fell asleep from sheer exhaustion and dreamed. He dreamed that instead of Mei Hatsum falling lifeless from the ceiling, it was a brunette, with rosy pink cheeks and eyes like his favorite Starbucks drink. He woke up and didn't get back to sleep. Uraraka woke up because her phone was going off. At first, she was irritated. She hadn't been able to fall asleep last night, staying up way too late crying into Ajui's shoulder. The frog hero hadn't been at the dance, she'd been on patrol, but news of the events had spread quickly amongst the hero community. Ajui had been waiting with a plate of sugar cookies and a blanket. Tradition, for missions gone so very wrong. She forced herself back to the present, sleep-blurred eyes staring at her phone. She had a few missed texts, but it was Deku's face dancing across her screen. He was calling her. She should answer. Hello, she said, her voice coming out a little more hoarse than she'd intended. Did you just wake up? Deku asked. She frowned. It was only 7. She hadn't exactly slept in. Why? You're supposed to be at the Hosu police station in an hour. Deku said, sounding a little worried. Your train ride is 40 minutes, at least. What? Uraraka shrieked, leaping out of bed and stumbling over her dress from last night. She'd just thrown it on the floor. What? What are you talking about? Check your texts, Uraraka-chan. Deku said, they're calling in the 3 of us and Kaken. 3 of us and Kaken. When had the 3 of us become Todoroki, Midoriya, and herself? What? Uraraka fell over again, this time because her phone was plugged in and she was trying to walk away without unplugging it. She stopped, stilling herself. Well, when you get there, tell them I'll be a little late but I'm on my way. Okay, Uraraka-chan. He seemed to hesitate. Are you okay? I'm okay, she said, calming enough to reassure him. I just really want to figure out who did this, and put a stop to them. That's the goal. Deku said, me too. She hung up after exchanging goodbyes, and stared at herself in the full-length mirror that came attached to her closet door. She still had one last night's makeup, despite managing to change herself into pajamas. She was going to be a little later than she thought. Uravity's public success would plummet if she was seen rushing through the streets looking a little like she was making a walk of shame. She shook her head and grabbed her super suit before rushing into the shower. When she got out, her eyes still had small smudges of mascara, but she wasn't going to be able to deal with that right now. She hurriedly squeezed herself into her suit, fastening on her bracelets and belt. She left her helmet by the door, as was habit now. She didn't like it. She made it onto the train 20 minutes after waking up. That was probably a record. Her hair was still wet, but she looked much more put together than she'd believed herself to be. An hour later, she burst into the police station, breathing a little from jogging all the way there from the train station. She met the startled eyes of several officers and nodded to them politely. I was requested? An officer stepped forward to lead her to the back room where the detectives were sitting. She nodded her head, told Uravity to stay safe, and ducked back out into the hall. About FNG time, round cheeks. Bakugo muttered, we've all been waiting. Deku stood up, offering her his chair. There were only 2 chairs. Todoroki nodded at her from where he was standing beside the desk. I'm fine standing, she said, like she hadn't been standing or jogging all morning since waking up. But she could feel Bakugo's eyes on her, weighing her, so she stood. Deku sat back down. We've called on your 4 because without you, last night may have gone a lot worse, the detective said. He had a badge on the desk beside him that read, Yagami. He didn't appear to have any physical quirk, if he had any at all. We're looking into a situation that has all the signs of an up-and-coming serial killer, and one intent on doing things quickly, if last night was anything to go by. Has any new information come up? Uraraka said because last she'd heard of the killer they were as lost as the rest of the city. The only new thing we have to say is that the 2 girls weren't random, the detective said, and then sighed. They're from the accounting department at UA. Your year. He cracked his neck and sighed again, which means, this is starting to look like the killer has a type. UA graduates of your year. It's just odd that they haven't chosen a specific department. Those were UA students? Deku's green eyes were big. He didn't recognize them. It wouldn't make much sense for you to. They probably never interacted with your class. Yagami folded his hands. We've been doing all we can to hunt down the killer, but there just isn't any evidence. We analyzed the entire ceiling, the skylight, everything. No DNA was present except Hatsum-san's. What was the cause of death? Todoroki asked, his arms crossed across his chest. She looked completely unharmed. That was true, Uraraka realized. She'd almost seemed asleep. Uraraka had thought she was just unconscious until Bakugo's horrified face told her otherwise. She glanced at him. The smudges under his eyes were darker than usual. She could see it just barely beneath his flashy mask. Heart attack, said Yagami. Uraraka's brow furrowed. Heart attack, she said, the question echoed by her 3 ex-classmates at about the same time. That's got to be quirk-induced. Hatsum-san was sleep-deprived, sure, but I doubt she would have a heart attack at her age. She seemed perfectly healthy. I saw her only a few weeks ago for an adjustment to my shoes and she was fine. Although I suppose heart attacks don't always have a lead-up of symptoms, it seems odd that. Todoroki put a hand on Deku's shoulder. Bakugo kicked his chair, nearly sending him sprawling. Shut the F up with your muttering. Yeah, heart attack is weird, but you don't have to have a FING panic attack about it. He reached out for the file, gauntlets clunking against the desk as he scooped it up to inspect it. Her cell count in her lungs was off too. And her ribs seemed to have tiny fractures. Yagami inclined his head. Todoroki moved around the chairs to look over Bakugo's shoulder, squinting in thought as he read carefully. Uraraka fiddled with one of her bracelets, thinking hard as she could. So why the f did you call us in? What do you want from us? Bakugo asked. You're the detective. You're supposed to solve the mystery and point us at it. Those are copies of the official case file, Yagami said, and they're yours to take. As it is, the four of you have been suspended from your agencies. Uraraka's head whipped up, mouth opening to protest, but Bakugo beat her to it. Excuse the F out of me? Not without pay. Yagami said quickly, because Uravity's eyes had started to glow with furious fire. You're being rented by the Investigation Bureau. Why us? Uravity asked. She was never the one picked for these sorts of things, but on top of that, they were all newbie heroes. Surely the Investigation Bureau wanted Endeavor or Hawks, or someone like Miruko. These are your classmates, and you've all proven yourself more than capable. The Investigation Bureau hopes that your personal attachment to the case will allow for a more speedy understanding of the killer's motives. Yagami leaned across the desk. Can we count on you to trade information with us, as we will with you, to solve this case before it gets out of hand? Yes, sir. Todoroki, Deku, and Uraraka said, while Bakugo gave a grunt. They were dismissed from the office. Uraraka's stomach growled loudly, but she pretended not to notice. Should we go back to one of our apartments to start our investigation? We can start it anywhere as long as we aren't too loud about it. Todoroki said, glancing at her stomach. And you seem hungry. Uraraka's already pink cheeks went a little more red. No. I'm fine. There's a coffee shop across the street. Bakugo jabbed his finger in a point as they exited the police station. They've got muffins and cupcakes and sheet. Let's go there. Good idea, Todoroki said, and before Uraraka could protest further they were crossing the street at the crosswalk and entering the tiny cafe. It was mostly empty, the only patrons being a small family with 2 kids, both of who squealed in delight as the heroes approached. The barista looked like she might faint as 4 of the biggest up-and-coming heroes approached her. Is there an emergency, heroes? She managed, holding a clear plastic cup and shaking. No, Todoroki said, and the barista AMU, her name tag red flushed vibrantly. Oh. We'd like to order. Todoroki said, are you ready? Todoroki paid for both his and Deku's food and drinks, despite the latter's protests. They claimed a table away from the windows, back near the bathrooms, and Uraraka watched as Deku poured way too much sugar in a cup of mint tea. She stared at the menu, frowning. She didn't get paid again until the following Thursday, and while she could easily afford to pay for whatever she wanted, she was hesitant. That much for a tiny cup of matcha? Surely that was a mistake. She blinked out of her daze when a gloved hand snapped its fingers in front of her face, a tiny explosion warming her nose. Oi, pink cheeks, what the hell do you want to eat? Bakugo growled, and she stared at him in confusion. I was going to get a strawberry cupcake and white vanilla bean frappuccino. She said, slowly, not sure why he cared. Get her that. And the cup of stupid matcha. Bakugo told the barista, and she rang out a total that was much higher than Uraraka would have ever spent on a single breakfast. What? Shut up. Bakugo snarled, and shoved her the plates of matcha cupcakes towards her chest. Now we're even, okay? Uraraka quickly grabbed the plates. Bakugo took the drinks that were handed to them, and glared at her again before stomping over to the table Todoroki and Deku had sequestered themselves at. Uraraka followed, still shocked at the turn of events. Bakugo roughly jostled her chair. Don't overthink it. He snapped, walking past her to another counter, where he poured an obscene amount of cinnamon into his already cinnamon-spiced drink. She smiled a soft and private smile. When she turned back to the table, Deku's eyes suddenly jerked away from her and back to his chocolate chip muffin. When Bakugo sat back down, he settled down with an egg and cheese biscuit covered in hot sauce. He gently set his gauntlets down, resting a booted foot on the edge of each so that he always knew where they were. Then he dropped his gloves by his elbow and started devouring his breakfast. His elbow jostled the table as he ate. Oh! Deku grunted suddenly, as if someone had punched him in the gut. A vibration quirk. What? Todoroki raised an eyebrow. Vibration at a cellular level. Kind of like how Lemillion-san can phase through things, But in this case it either hasn't been perfected, or it's more of a damaging quirk. Deku said, if someone put their hand through someone's chest, and if the frequency of their vibrations wasn't quite perfect enough, then they would be able to disrupt a heart's natural rhythm dash, and cause the lung damage and rib fractures as well. Todoroki looked vaguely stunned. It hadn't been him, after all, completing Deku's sentences and following along. It hadn't even been Uraraka. No, of course it was Bakugo. Uraraka shared his shaken glance and Bakugo liked hot sauce off the heel of his hand. What? Shut the F up, icy thought. Bakugo snapped. It was easy enough to follow along. Can't you keep up with your shitty boyfriend? Uraraka kicked his ankle with her boot and he bared his teeth at her, like an animal, but didn't shove her back. She took a huffy bite of her cupcake and he rolled his eyes. So, the phasing. Once the phones went off, the table vibrated violently and Uraraka plucked her pink cell phone up quickly. It was an address, followed quickly by the words, "Be prepared. We found more." More? Uraraka asked through cheeks puffed out thickly with the rest of her cupcake. Deku said, I think they mean victims. Suddenly, the rest of her food didn't look so appetizing. The crime scene had already been photographed by the forensics team when they made their way up the street to it. Samples were still being taken, so they couldn't get very close to investigate, but honestly Bakugo didn't really want to. When he'd caught Hatsume's corpse midair, there had almost been something peaceful about it. She hadn't looked hurt. It had almost looked like she'd been sleeping. There could be no mistaking these corpses for sleeping. It was so much worse. There was blood. All over the walls of the alley, there was blood. Dripping down in swatches, like they'd been painting the walls but hadn't quite finished. The bodies themselves didn't look mangled or damaged enough to have lost this much blood, but they did look broken. Bakugo stared at their painfully still limbs, at the lack of a rise and fall from their chests, and clenched his jaw. He knew these two. He knew them even better than he'd known Hatsume. He's threatened to kill one of them, several times over. The other spent nights at his house. Minomanito. He still had his hand wrapped around the other victim's wrist. And God if he wasn't going to throw up when he tried to look at the other body. Tetsu. He had to look away. Scrawled on the cement below the haphazardly tossed bodies, like the label on a space in a horrifying version of Monopoly, were words, written in blood. 1 by 1, 2 by 2, next is 3. Can't you protect them? Bakugo wanted to rage. Wanted to find whoever did this and tear them apart. He wanted them to pay. Kirishima was going to be beside himself with grief. Tetsu had become one of his closest friends. And to keep threatening them like this? He clenched his fists, focusing on the rasp of the leather from his gloves, and the barely audible noise of sweat moving inside his grenades. Uraraka, beside him, was tense as a bowstring. Her skin-tight suit did little to hide the way she was trembling, just a little, though the expression on her face was far from fearful. Deku and Todoroki had their pinkies linked, carefully out of view. A tiny offering of comfort for one another, where hopefully the press wouldn't see. Cause of death? Todoroki asked, again for the second time in the same day. Bakugo's teeth ached from clenching his jaw. What do you mean? Probably goddamn blood loss. Idiot heroes. One of the younger members of the forensics team sneered, and a few of his companions snickered. Yeah. Bakugo snarled, bowing up as he stepped up beside Todoroki. From what heaving wounds, moron? That shut him up immediately, as he realized that Bakugo was right. The bodies didn't have any visible wounds. Deku shot him a look. He ignored it. Uraraka gave him a smile. He tried to ignore that too. We'll be able to give you more details in a few hours. We have to wait for the labs to analyze it. Yagami said, suddenly appearing from down the street. Earliest I can promise it is about 2 o'clock. Bakugo watched Uraraka look at her phone. Barely 9 am. He huffed. I need to call Kirishima. Bakugo said quietly, he should know. We're already sending agents to tell their families. Yagami said, so that should be okay. But it needs to wait. Bakugo felt himself bristle. Uraraka, beside him, asked why. Yagami led them through the police tape, carefully stepping around the bodies and blood so as not to disturb anything. The heroes mimicked his footsteps, placing their boots only where he placed his. Eventually, Yagami came to a full stop and pointed. "This is why you're here," he said, and Bakugo followed the line of his arm to the ground. A fully formed, perfect bloody footprint graced his vision, and he froze. "Evidence. It's a size 6. Women's." Yagami said, "I can send the brand over to you in a text. But I want you to scour this block and the ones around it. Whoever made this big of a mess didn't get off without a drop on them." Bakugo was already moving, surprised to see Uraraka at his shoulder. The blood was still fresh. The culprit could be nearby. He sent Uraraka a look as he turned right, and she nodded, sprinting across the street. Deku and Todoroki went left, and they began to search. Their presence drew both concerned and awe-filled eyes. Bakugo gruffly refused to give an autograph to some starry-eyed woman, apologizing only as an afterthought as he made it to the end of the block and didn't see anything suspicious. He scowled, scanning this way and that, trying to find where to go. "Ground Zero, please, an autograph." He snarled in frustration, "I'm kinda busy here. Please." "No. Ground Zero." A notebook was shoved so close to his face, if he hadn't reared back he would have cut his nose. As it was, it only just brushed his cheek. He immediately bristled, slapping the notebook out of his face and snarling at the petite woman holding it. She flinched away, tears erupting, and fled. Get lost. That was definitely going to come down badly on his PR handler later, but if it. "Kakken, up here," Deku called, and Bakugo looked up to see him on a rooftop. He blasted his way up there easily, landing with a crunch of gravel beneath his boots. "Find something? I thought that she might have come up here, because it's too busy in the streets for her to have." Bakugo nudged Deku none too gently, thinking he'd gotten distracted, or forgot to speak out loud or something. But Deku had frozen, staring at him. "What?" he snarled. "What the hell are you staring for?" "Kakken," Deku said, reaching out and touching his face. Bakugo reared back, startled and uncomfortable at the almost gentle contact, and Deku held up his hand. There was blood on his fingers. Bakugo slapped a hand to his own cheek and looked at the fingers of his glove. Blood. Not much, he wasn't the one bleeding, but there was blood on his face. He spun around, slamming his hands on the ledge lining the roof of the building they stood on, scanning the streets. What did she look like? Little he knew, and he thought she had dark hair. But was it black? Dark brown? He cursed under his breath, looking for someone crying. Deku peppered questions at his back. "I don't know. I don't remember." Bakugo snapped. She had dark hair, and she was crying. "She asked for my autograph." Deku began pointing out people in the crowd, and Bakugo roared again, launching himself over the side and shoving through the crowd. "Did anyone see a girl crying? Short with a notebook?" Everyone shook their heads, and he raked his hands through his hair. She was gone. They searched for hours, but there was no trace of her anywhere. No more blood, no sightings. Bakugo slammed his fist into the wall and cursed some more. "It's not your fault, Kakken," Deku said, and Bakugo rounded on him, explosions going off in his palms. "Shut the hell up, Deku. If I hadn't been so It was a tactic to rile you up. You shouldn't let her win." Todoroki interrupted, cool as ever in the face of one of his tantrums, but Bakugo had grown a lot. He backed down. "Why didn't she just kill me then?" Bakugo snarled, "I wasn't even looking at her. Because she needs 3 people for her next murder." Uraraka said, "Didn't? You see? First, just Hatsum. Then those 2. Next, it's going to be 3. She's trying to escalate it. What do we do? If we're always one step behind, she's going to kill whoever she wants and we won't be able to stop it." Todoroki said, "We're out of our depth." "No, I think we can do this," Deku said, fiddling with his gloves. "I don't think she'll strike again today. We should go home, somewhere we can all be together and focus on this. There's gotta be a pattern or something. My apartment's available, but we'd have to keep it down. Fuchan had a really late patrol last night, even after I kept her up talking, and so she's sleeping. Then perhaps it is best we don't bring Bakugo into your apartment right now," Todoroki said, and Bakugo set off another explosion in his palm. Our place is halfway packed, since we're moving, Deku said apologetically. Bakugo frowned. FNG fine. Kirishima isn't supposed to be back until dinner time anyways, so we've got the place to ourselves. Just don't FNG touch anything. Deku looked a little too pleased to be invited over to Bakugo's apartment, but Bakugo didn't take the offer back. He just hoped Kirishima hadn't draped their laundry across the couch again. Bakugo's apartment was nicer than hers, Uraraka noted. More expensive, definitely. But that was because she liked to be frugal. Cheap even. Bakugo clearly did not. He was on the top floor of the building, with giant windows that made up an entire wall. It had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a pretty nice kitchen. Uraraka counted 5 little potted plants decorating the windowsill and shelves, before Bakugo shoved them all into the apartment and slammed the door behind him. Don't touch anything unless I say you can, he grumbled, moving into the main room. It was also much neater than Uraraka had imagined. Bakugo stomped down the hallway and slammed his bedroom door shut before returning. He glared at them all. For F's sake, sit down. You said not to touch anything, Uraraka said. Bakugo rolled his eyes. Fine. Make yourselves at home. If I hit you, it means mind your business. They settled into his living room almost like they'd been coming there for years. Todoroki sat primly on one of the leather couches while Deku settled onto the floor in front of him. Uraraka took the big plush chair, and Bakugo perched on the armrest of the couch, opposite end of Todoroki. Let's look over the files again, Deku said. I told Yagami-san about my theory as to the villain's quirk, so he's also going to send us a file full of registered phasing and vibration quirks. In the meantime, he began to spread the files over Bakugo's coffee table, gently moving PS4 controllers and a paper plate with Kirishima's breakfast leftovers out of the way. Bakugo took the plate to the trash with a grimace. They talked for hours. Once the details of the 2nd and 3rd murders came in, they printed them out and added them to the pile. Todoroki began reading the file on quirks, splitting it with Bakugo, and they worked on that for a while. Bakugo dragged a pencil through another name, and winced as the lead broke again. He was pushing too hard. He still hadn't talked to Kirishima about Tetsu. He wanted to do it in person and the idiot hadn't answered his phone. We need a different approach. We're all getting frustrated, and the tension is gonna smother me, Uraraka said, flopping back into the cushy chair she'd claimed. Bakugo glared at her. That's a good idea. Kaken, can I use that wall? Deku pointed at the wall beside the giant windows. Bakugo shrugged. He and Kirishima hadn't really gotten around to decorating in the few months they'd lived here. They were both a little lazy about that. Deku also helped himself to some tape that he found in a bowl by the sink, setting about taping things to the wall. Bakugo sat back on his haunches to watch, eyes narrowed as he followed Deku's rapid-fire, often scattered way of thought. Most people thought in trains of thought. Deku thought in landslides, it felt like. But Bakugo could see his organization method. And as she stood up to help, he could tell Uraraka did as well. Oh, I don't have my string, Deku said, turning wide eyes on Bakugo. I can't help you, he said. I don't have any string. I'm not a freak. Deku shrugged. I'll go get some, there's a craft store down the street. And I'll bring back dinner, okay? What does everyone want? Soba, Todoroki said. At the same time Bakugo growled something about a ramen place across the street. Actually, sorry Todoroki-kun, but ramen sounds really good right now, Uraraka said. She pulled a few bills from a pouch hidden inside her belt and handed them over. Just a regular please. Very well, Todoroki said, seeming to not care much. I'll take an order of tsukmen then. They call the one I want fireball ramen. You'll know the one. Bakugo passed over his money as well, and Midoriya nodded. I'll be back in an hour, maybe an hour and some change. He smiled at them all, and then without warning he gave Todoroki a kiss on the lips, holding his cheek like he was some kind of princess. Bakugo hastily looked away. Todoroki had a light blush on his cheeks at the display of affection, but didn't look upset in the least. Return safely, Midoriya. Deku nodded, and then he hurried out the door and let it swing closed behind him. Bakugo went to get them all something to drink from the kitchen. His legs protested to so many hours on the floor. Do you really set yourself on fire sometimes when you blush? Uraraka asked, a laugh in her voice. He glanced over his shoulder. She had her feet up on the chair, painted pink toes wiggling against the armrest. He got so distracted by how comfortable and at ease she looked in his home that he almost missed Todoroki's answer. Is it true the first time someone kissed you, you floated away and had to grab a street light to stop yourself? What the F dash? Bakugo snorted, while Uraraka turned pink as her suit and puffed her cheeks out at Todoroki. But, she pouted, that was a secret between me and Deku. Oops. Todoroki said, looking amused. They seemed to decide against continuing to work without Deku, making small talk amongst the two of them as Bakugo first went to change clothes. Then the three of them as Bakugo went back to the kitchen and made Todoroki some tea. He seemed really against using their kettle, for whatever reason, so Bakugo did it himself and poured Uraraka a glass of juice. I'm gonna run home really quick actually. Uraraka said, I want to grab some clothes and change. Unfortunately, my suit isn't really comfortable. Bakugo gave her a once-over, thinking that he could see why it might not be comfortable when it clung to her every curve and rounded edge. She had so many curves. He wanted to touch the material of her suit and figure out what it felt like under his bare fingers. He started out of his daze, only realizing he'd been staring when he dragged his eyes back to her face that she'd been watching him watch her. Okay, do what you want, he said, quickly turning back around and nearly burning himself grabbing the tea kettle. Couldn't you just loan her some clothes? Todoroki asked, raising one eyebrow. Deku will be back in a few minutes at this point. Bakugo had a brief image of Uraraka in his hero uniform flash through his head before a drop of boiled water ran over his knuckles and he was forced out of it, snarling. Do you want to borrow clothes, pink cheeks? He snapped with much more anger than necessary, looking over his shoulder at her. She looked startled, but he could see a faint pink sliding across her cheeks. Just FING ask for what you want then, sheet. Like I give a DMN. He gestured with his arm for her to follow him as he headed for his room. He heard a scuffling behind him, but forced himself not to turn and look. His face was red, he was sure of it. No need for them to see that. As soon as Bakugo moved around the corner, Uraraka swatted at Todoroki, glaring heatedly. What is wrong with you? She hissed, blushing furiously. Just helping my friends. Midoriya says that it's very important. And Yamamo implied, well. He looked down the hallway. Things. Momo makes things up. Ugh. Uraraka snapped, but she couldn't say much more without leaving Bakugo waiting in another part of the house, so she hurriedly scampered after him, bare feet shying away from the cold floors. Bakugo was in his bedroom, bent over his dresser as he dug through it. It was so clean, Uraraka found herself looking for some kind of imperfection. The bed wasn't made, she noticed, and one of his All Might posters was a little crooked. She felt something inside her soften, suddenly, when she realized that he had letters from his mom thrown across his desk, and then that something completely melted as she noticed a class picture framed on it as well. Stop your snooping, round cheeks. Bakugo's harsh voice made her jump, for some reason, and she turned around just in time to get a pair of sweatpants in her face, and something else on top of it. A tank top, she saw as she pulled it off her head. She looked up. You're FING welcome. You can leave your super suit in here, if you want. Just don't touch anything. He didn't give her a chance to respond, slamming the door behind him. Bakugo fled to the bathroom, slamming that door as well. He stared at himself for a long moment. She wouldn't get out of his head. The way the curl of her hair had fluffed up and frazzled from pulling the sweatpants off her head. The little tilt of her soft smile as she looked around the room. Her eyes, which he kept coming back to. The softness that made up every aspect of her, except for how incredibly strong she was. The dangerous sway of her hips, the curve of her waist. He could probably fit his hands around her sides perfectly. He turned the sink on, and cupped the water in his palms. His hands were so sweaty. He muttered out loud. Inside his bedroom, Uraraka stared at herself in the mirror above Bakugo's dresser. She recognized this shirt, which meant anyone that saw her in it no doubt would recognize it too. But there was something charming about it. Bakugo used to wear the black tank top, with its colorful skull motif, all the time in high school. It had to be one of his favorites. The fact that he let her borrow it. Uraraka clapped her hands to her cheeks, and then quickly had to release her quirk as her feet lifted off the floor. Don't do it, Kacchako, she thought, no emotions for the emotionally constipated hothead. As if she could somehow convince herself there weren't any, that would be lovely. She patted her way back to the living room. Todoroki gave her a once-over that felt nothing like Bakugo's had, and smiled with his eyes. Shut up, she threatened, don't you dare. Todoroki feigned an innocent expression, and Uraraka pondered hitting him. What a Bakugo thing to do, she thought, and instantly regretted it. Bakugo joined them moments later, and he once again looked at Uraraka. He ran into the island in the middle of his kitchen, and whirled on the both of them. Not a FING word. About the look on your face, or you running into things in your own apartment? Todoroki asked blandly. FING. I'm back, Deku announced, opening the door and brandishing his 2 bags. There was dead silence for a moment, then Uraraka burst into laughter, covering her face. They settled down to eat, all choosing to ignore the way Deku's eyes kept flicking from Bakugo to Uraraka's shirt and back again. I think we can cross Kyoji Makanari off the list, Todoroki volunteered, once the silence had stretched into dangerous territory and Bakugo's furious aura had threatened them all enough. Just like that, they were back on track. One by one, they finished their ramen and set the bowls aside. Bakugo got up at one point, piling them all together, and walked back into the kitchen. Todoroki was talking more about Kyoji Makanari. The plastic bowls in Bakugo's hand hit the floor. They spilled across the tile. They spilled across his socked feet. He didn't seem to notice, staring at the clock on his oven. Bakugo! Uraraka stood up and approached slowly. You okay? It's 8 o'clock, he said, and his voice sounded strangled. The others moved into the kitchen as well, circling warily. Yes. So, Kirishima should have been home at 6. Deku grabbed the island in front of him. Call him. At once, Bakugo whipped out his phone. He punched Kirishima's stupid grinning contact photo and slammed it against his ear, listening to the dial tone with his entire heart in his throat. Uraraka's hand curled around his other arm, and for once he didn't throw her off. It went to voicemail. He tried again. Voicemail. Deku tried, and Uraraka. Even Todoroki. Voicemail, each and every one of them. Bakugo tried again, desperate, the tension in his throat making his eyes sting. Voicemail. This time, he left a message. Damn it, Kiri-Idru, call me back. If you're okay, you'd better call me back. The beep as he ended the message made his eyes sting. Uraraka had never seen Bakugo cry. She was sure Deku had, given how long they'd known each other. But never had he cried in front of her, not in 5 years. Not until the day Kirishima-Idru didn't show up for dinner. Almost immediately after completing the voicemail, she and Bakugo had changed back into their hero costumes. She tried to use the bathroom to change, but before she could even move, Bakugo had grabbed his clothes and vanished inside. She heard the sink running again when she passed, suited up a few moments later. It didn't mask the sound of his breathing, heavy and quick, like he was panicking. When he came out, only a few seconds later, she wondered if she'd imagined it. He looked so steady and in control. He buckled on his gauntlets. I'm going to look for him. We all are. Let's go in pairs so we don't get caught off guard, Uraraka said, and Bakugo shrugged before shouldering open his front door and hurrying down the hallway, his boots making muted thuds on the old, stained carpet. He didn't seem to care if they followed or not. She glanced back at the other 2 boys, and they both nodded to her. We'll go downtown. You guys go where you need to, Deku said, and if you get in trouble, I'll send you an SOS. Promise. She nodded to both of them and rushed after Bakugo. She caught up to him on the stairs. There were 6 floors to this building. He had deemed the elevator too slow, and was preparing to jump down the middle of the staircase. Uraraka shrugged and took his hand, vaulting over the railing and dragging him with her. What, hey, pink cheeks, watch it? He looked startled, and she was glad. Anything to get the haunted look gone from his big, sad eyes. A few feet from the floor, she stopped them falling with ease, and as soon as they had their feet under them, she released her quirk. He looked at her, his eyes narrowed just the slightest bit, lips parted. Sometimes when he looked at her like that, Uraraka thought she might float away, even without her quirk. He looked soft, proud. The moment was broken as he shoved open the back door and led her out into the street. It was chilly out, getting colder as they neared winter. We'll go to where he works. Maybe he's just doing overtime and not checking his phone. Uraraka nodded. Kirishima wasn't at his agency. In fact, Fat Gum reported sleepily that he'd left hours ago. He wasn't at his favorite karaoke bar, where he sometimes disappeared for hours at a time with Mina or Kaminari. Thinking of them, Bakugo called them both. Then he called Siro. His fingers shook as he dialed Jiru's number. Kirishima wasn't there either. Bakugo was close to breaking down. Uraraka could see it in the twitch of his fingers, the nervous skitter of his eyes. They took to the skies, blasting around in something a little too jerky to be called flying, but with too much airtime to just be jumping. They searched block after block. Nothing. And then they found him. Uraraka choked on her breath, her eyes stinging with a sudden flood of tears. She felt Bakugo's hand tighten on hers, then let go. A spot of red hair, stepping out of a house still in his hero suit, miles from anywhere he should have been. Kirishima! Bakugo roared as he fell out of the sky, hands blazing. Kirishima jerked back a step, then looked up. Bakugo slammed into him. If Kirishima hadn't hardened up, they'd both have hit the ground. As it was, Kirishima simply tore up a foot of sidewalk instead. Warning, please. We talked about warnings. Where the F were you? Bakugo demanded, holding his friend by the shoulders at arm's length. Uraraka gently touched down on the sidewalk behind him, wringing her hands. I heard the news. About Tetsu. Kirishima's eyes, Uraraka noticed as he softened up again, were wet. Bakugo's harsh grip softened slightly. Uraraka took a half step forward, hesitating. So I went to buy flowers. And then I came here. It's his house. He lived with his parents. Kirishima was fighting hard not to cry. Uraraka surged forward and hugged him before thinking better of it. His arm came tightly around her back, and she felt his tears warm the top of her head. Sheet. Bakugo said quietly. And then Uraraka found herself with one of his arms around her too, the grenade digging painfully into her lower back. I'm sorry. I wanted to tell you. But I didn't want to do it over the phone. Uraraka had never heard Bakugo apologize, either. Kirishima squeezed them both tighter. Bakugo's breath warmed her forehead. She blinked open her eyes, and found his staring at her. This isn't about us, she thought, but her arm came around Bakugo's back anyways. His tank top was soft. His back was not. Reluctantly, she broke away from the embrace after a long moment. Bakugo immediately backed off as well, his cheeks lightly pink. Uraraka pretended not to notice him rub his face. Kirishima made no effort to hide the sight of him wiping away his tears. We found him. He's safe. Back to Bakugo's apartment? She texted Deku, not even thinking about it. Kirishima's okay? Deku checked. He's safe. He was visiting a friend. Then let's take a break for the night. I think we need a step back. We can reconvene tomorrow. Deku always made the decisions, she thought somewhere in the back of her mind. Deku is suggesting we take a break for the night. She said out loud. Take a break from what? Kirishima asked, and Bakugo waved at him as if to say, tell you later. That's fine. You can all come over tomorrow. I'm up at 8 usually, so after that, it's fine. He said, shrugging. When do you go in, Kirishima? Tomorrow? Kirishima tapped his head, thinking. 6 I think. In the morning? Bakugo sighed. Your schedule avances, man. Kirishima shrugged. Uraraka smiled. Her phone pinged again. Heard about the hero killings. Are you okay? It was Azui. Uraraka suddenly felt horribly guilty for not checking on her. She quickly sent a response. I'm sorry. I gotta sign the case. I've been at Bakugo's house all day. Good luck with that. My agency is having all the heroes sleep in a specific hotel until the killer is caught, to avoid any losses. I can ask if you can come along if you want? Ajui's agency was one of the smaller, but popular beachfront rescue agencies. It made sense that they'd want to protect their heroes as well as possible. Uraraka should say yes. Sleeping alone in an abandoned apartment would be dangerous. And yet, who's got you frowning so bad, Kacchako? Kirishima asked, gently sing-songing her name. She looked up in surprise. Tsuchan is spending the night at a hotel. Her agency insists. She found herself saying, ever the honest Kacchako. Bakugo had shot Kirishima a glare. Uraraka wasn't sure why, but he quickly snapped his eyes back to hers at her statement. What? Froggy isn't gonna be at your place? Froppy, Uraraka corrected, and no. But it's okay. I'm a big girl. I can take care of myself. Come stay with us, Kirishima said, while Bakugo said, come stay with me. There was a tense silence. Kirishima sent Bakugo a stunned look. Bakugo refused to make eye contact with him, staring instead steadily at Uraraka. Well, angel face? Uraraka's stomach had simply been full of butterflies at the offer of staying. At the new nickname, however, it flew the coop completely. She lost it. Her stomach was now gone. And her heart was in her mouth. Surely if she talked now, even to respond, they'd all watch her heart fly out and smash to pieces on the floor. If it won't bother you too much, she said. Had she said that? Out loud? She hadn't told her mouth to move. I don't offer sheet if I don't mean it. Bakugo muttered, looking away. Shut up about it already. Let's just go. Kirishima looked on the verge of exploding. Bakugo shoved his shoulder roughly and took off walking down the sidewalk. Uraraka and Kirishima watched him go for a moment, Uraraka numbly texting Ajui that it was okay, she'd stay with a friend. Then she grinned, a savage smile that she only felt sometimes when the fire of competition spurred her on. She held out a hand to Kirishima. Running start. Ready? Kirishima's shark-like teeth made an appearance. He hardened up and took off at a dead sprint, Uraraka at his side. At the peak of speed they jumped. She slapped his hand and they went soaring past Bakugo, Uraraka's wild laughter making him jump and fall off the sidewalk. What the F dash? He shouted, immediately igniting his hands. Uraraka laughed and reached for him. She saw his scowl melt instantly into a smile as he reached back. He grabbed her, tugging her towards himself. As she collided with his chest, legs tangling with his, she heard him laugh. Not his competitive, maniacal cackle that he did to show off, but something softer, deeper. She looked up and he was staring at her. She wanted to kiss him. He was looking at her mouth. Then Kirishima plowed through a fence. Uraraka broke out of her starry-eyed daze and quickly released her quirk as he bounced back up into the sky, threatening to fly away. Bakugo grunted at her sudden weight, but a few well-placed explosions with his free arm kept them from completely wiping out. They still hit the ground, but it was a tumble instead. Bakugo caught her on top of his chest, keeping her head from hitting the ground. That's why she had a helmet. She should wear that? Probably. She lost her train of thought again. Bakugo was looking up at her with his lips parted, eyes half-masked. They looked like she didn't know. So soft. Gentle even. She'd never seen Bakugo look at anyone like that. His eyes were pretty, she realized. They were so red. His eyelashes were long, brushing his cheeks when he blinked. His bottom lip was bitten. Oh, she said, quiet and soft. I gonna get off me, pink cheeks? She surged off him immediately, standing and glancing at the fence before shrugging. We should make a run for it. Kirishima shrugged too, plucking a daisy from his hair. They took off down the street, Bakugo chasing their heels, and ran until they made it around the corner. Kirishima was the first one to laugh, Uraraka echoing him. And Bakugo smiled. They made their way back to the apartment Kirishima and Bakugo shared. Kirishima unlocked the door, and Uraraka picked a piece of grass off his shoulder armor as he did, all too conscious of Bakugo, just a step behind her. The apartment was as they'd left it. Nobody had cleaned up the mess in the kitchen, but Bakugo moved to do it now. Kirishima fixed the curtains in the living room and stared at their crime scene wall for a moment too long before ripping himself away. I'm showering first. Neither of you are covered in grass stains, he declared, and then disappeared into the bathroom. You can sleep in my room, Bakugo said from his knees on the floor, and Uraraka carefully told herself not to float away. I don't mind the couch, she managed, noticing that her voice was very high. That would be stupid. Bakugo rolled his eyes. Just take the bed. I can either sleep on Ei's futon or the couch. But I don't want to kick you. It's fine. Bakugo snapped. Don't make me have you sleep somewhere stupid, like the ceiling. Wouldn't be the first time I slept up there. Uraraka sighed, and Bakugo looked at her like she was crazy. My quirk? Don't tell me you've never exploded something in your sleep. Bakugo sniffed, finishing cleaning the floor and standing up. When did he get so much taller than her? I haven't exploded anything in my sleep since I was 5. He said proudly, and Uraraka rolled her eyes. Okay, tough guy. She glanced away from him as Kirishima came out of the shower, a towel wrapped around his hips and another in his hair. Immediately, she shrieked, covering her face. You f***ing idiot. What the hell are you trying to do? Bakugo roared, explosions going off in his palms. Whoops. Kirishima said, sorry. I was thinking like she was Mina. What? Uraraka squeaked, still covering her face. She peeked through her fingers though and inwardly nodded. She covered her eyes again. Don't compare her to your perverted FANG Raccoon Beach. Go put some clothes on. Sorry. A door slammed, so Uraraka deemed peeked through her fingers again. Bakugo was standing in front of her, his back to her like he was personally shielding her from Kirishima's ND body. She dropped her hands and laughed awkwardly. He's such a dumbass. Bakugo rolled his eyes, but all his friends do the same sheet. All your friends? Uraraka said, they're yours too. I guess. Bakugo shook his head. FNG perverts. So, we probably should have stopped by my apartment, Uraraka said awkwardly. I don't have any clothes here. Or anything. Just wear the ones I gave you earlier. Bakugo said as though she were stupid. We can go to your stupid place tomorrow and get you clothes or whatever. My shampoo and sheet is in there, just go use that. The bathroom lock is broken, but I'll make sure Kirishima doesn't bother you and stuff. She stared at him, analyzing. Was this Bakugo, or a shapeshifter that had replaced him? Surely her Bakugo, the real Bakugo, she meant, not hers was never this soft. If, are you staring at round cheeks? Go and shower before your smell stinks up my whole apartment. Uraraka skittered off to his bedroom, first, to grab clothes, and then she vanished into the bathroom. He heard the shower running, and immediately tried to stop whatever train of thought was coming in its tracks. But even he couldn't stop a moving train. Well, not by sheer force of strength. So the idea sprang into his mind anyways. Uraraka peeling off the suit that she always complained about, but never changed. Uraraka stepping into his shower, water rushing over her soft skin. Uraraka using his soap and it running down her body, his towel wrapping around her soft, warm chest, clinging to her wide hips, covering her just barely enough as she stood in his bathroom still dripping from the shower. Dude, are you thinking about Kacchako naked? While standing in our living room. Kirishima sounded amused. Bakugo was not amused to have been dragged from his daydream. Or mocked about it. Shut the F that I was not? Bakugo roared, turning on his friend, and Kirishima laughed. So what were you doing? Standing there, staring at the bathroom door like a creep. Shut up, shitty hair. Kirishima cackled some more, and moved into the kitchen to make them all some tea before bed. Bakugo glared at him the whole time, but it was mostly to avoid looking back at the bathroom door. He heard it unlock, and watched Kirishima turn to look at him. He did not turn around, angrily steeping the tea he was making and scowling at the counter. Uraraka ummed, and Bakugo burned his fingers again. He saw her distorted reflection in the microwave. She was stretching. You took your effing time, I see. Bakugo grumbled, turning around. Mistake. 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 God, she wore his clothes so much better than he did. If you need anything tonight, feel free to knock on my door. Bakugo gets grouchy when you wake him up, but I don't mind. Bakugo could kill him, he really could. Okay. Thank you, Kirishima-kun. He could kill them both. Good night, Kacchako. Where did he get the right to call her that? Bakugo wanted to call her that. Good night. He was still staring, he realized. Uraraka didn't seem to realize, though, so it didn't matter. He moved a mug of tea at her, carefully not spilling. I didn't add sheet. Don't care. The sugar is right there, and honey is in the cabinet by the fridge or some sheet. There's regular milk and soy. I don't care. He wanted to storm off and hide in his room, but he'd offered it to her for the night, at least. Storming to the couch didn't seem to be a good option. Your towels smell good, Uraraka said, and then frowned so intensely Bakugo was slightly startled. What kind of weird thing to say was that? Uraraka internally screamed, don't admit to smelling towels. That's my hands. Nitroglycerin smells like caramel. What the F dash? Bakugo demanded of himself, don't if he respond to a shitty comment like that by telling her your towels smell good because of sweat. Oh, Uraraka said. She finished her tea. Good night. Go the F to bed. Bakugo blurted out, but it lacked all of his usual sting. Yep. Uraraka yelped, dashing off. Bakugo sat down on his couch. What the F dash? When she woke up, it was to barely hushed shouting happening in the living room. She rolled over, wondering who the hell Tsuyu could possibly be yelling at. Tsuyu never yelled. She yawned and snuggled deeper into the bed. The really soft bed. With expensive sheets, and 3 more pillows that she usually had. Her eyes flickered open to slate gray pillows, a little damp with her drool. Red and black bedclothes. And no pink polka-dotted. Puppy dog stuffed toys. And that smelled like candy. She surged upright, flinching away from the pillows she'd been cuddling, and nearly fell out of bed. She caught herself with her quirk last minute, and silently dropped to the floor instead of crashing down onto it. She puffed out a sigh of relief. That would have been attention-drawing, which could only lead to her being embarrassed as either Kirishima or Bakugo came to see what she was doing, banging around in his bedroom. Phrasing, Kacchako phrasing. She hurriedly stood up, staring at the blankets in her hands before deciding it was probably weird to just keep fumbling around, and so she quickly put the blankets on the bed, straightened them neatly, and promptly fled the room. She came into the living room, and the yelling stopped abruptly. She watched as 3 sets of eyes swung towards her. One widened in disbelief. One began to smile. The last narrowed to angry red slits. It's about tea time you got up, slow ass. Bakugo snarled. His hair looked fluffier than usual. The bags under his eyes were even darker. Uraraka wanted to ask why, but didn't. It felt like that would be odd in present company. Oh, Deku said, blatantly staring, and Uraraka blinked at him slowly. The last dregs of sleep still made everything a little hard to deal with. She wasn't sure when the last time she'd slept so well as she had last night had been. Good morning, Uraraka. Todoroki said politely, sipping a cup of tea while sitting in the armchair she'd claimed yesterday. It looks like you slept well. Uraraka nodded. Yeah, I did. She smiled, turning to thank Bakugo for his hospitality, but he'd already stomped off towards his bedroom. She tilted her head, watching him go, and jumped when he slammed the door. You stayed the night? Here? Deku asked, fumbling a bit over his words. With Kakken? Uraraka's logical brain suddenly caught up with the events of last night, and this morning, and how they might look to Deku and Todoroki. She felt her entire face turn red, and gulped loudly. Oh. No, it wasn't like that. We aren't. It's okay if you are. Deku said quickly, you know I want both of you to be really happy and I think. We're not like that. Uraraka said, shaking her head violently and hugging herself, nothing happened. He's grown a lot, I don't even think about when he used to bully. No, Deku, I swear. But if you did, what are we all effing yelling about? Shut the hell up. Bakugo snarled, returning to the living room with fresh clothes on. Deku bowed deeply and blurted out, "I'm just very happy for you." There was a very tense, awkward silence. It lasted too long to be brushed off. Todoroki lifted his phone in front of his face and pretended to read a text message. Deku stayed in his bow, and Bakugo stared at him in fury, likely because, by the confused tilt of his eyebrows, he had no idea what Deku was talking about. Uraraka put her hands to her stomach, wondering if it would make things worse if she threw up. It certainly felt like she might. The door unlocked and Kirishima appeared. He either didn't notice the tense standoff happening, or didn't care. "Hi guys. I forgot my belt. Fat sent me back to get it, because my breathes almost fell down." The silence remained, now partially disrupted by Kirishima making his way through his own apartment, grabbing said belt off the back of the couch, and then leaving again. "Bye. Catch this crazy guy, will you? Oh, and Kacchako, I left you some bacon in the fridge." With that, he shut the door. Uraraka gave a nervous laugh. Deku had already stood up, but now the rest of the room seemed to relax. Todoroki stood up and motioned to the board, and nobody mentioned that Uraraka was in Bakugo's clothes, having slept in his bed, or any of it. Before they'd stopped last night, they'd settled on 5 potential suspects. All fit Bakugo's approximate height range for the girl he'd met, and all had some type of phasing quirk. None of them had a criminal record of any kind. But why the hell was there a bomb at the gala? Bakugo asked, glaring at the red and blue and green strings Deku had strung all over his wall. "That's definitely a missing link." Deku thumbed his bottom lip. I think we're missing something." "Motive also." Uraraka said, "Some of the people targeted barely interacted. I don't think Tetsutetsukuin ever asked for support gear, and the 2 girls you saved had never met any of them except Minoma. And everyone knew Minoma, he was..." She trailed off, seeming to realize that she'd been about to speak badly of a dead person. Bakugo frowned intensely. "Something ain't right." After another 15 minutes of staring at the wall and Bakugo and Todoroki arguing about where one of the red strings should lead, Uraraka's stomach growled loudly enough for them all to hear it. Todoroki sent her an amused look. Bakugo glared. "You're supposed to ask for sheet when you want it." Uraraka shrugged helplessly. "We felt busy?" He rolled his eyes and moved towards the kitchen. "I'll make us all some DMN food." Todoroki nodded, moving the red string while Bakugo's back was turned. Deku, however, was smiling too widely at Uraraka. She ignored him, approaching the paper that listed all the details they had about the bomb. Small detonation zone. 3-minute timer, no found handheld detonator outside of that. The 2 girls had been chained to it with regular steel cables. She frowned suddenly, a thought occurring. "Deku," she said, looking intense. "Was the countdown already going when you found the girls with the bomb?" Deku looked at her. He'd been watching Bakugo move around the kitchen with a scrutinizing, sharp green eye. At her words, he pet his head like a thoughtful puppy. "On the bomb?" He seemed to catch up to her thought process immediately. "Oh, I see." Bakugo shook a pan, the smell of frying vegetables filling the air as he cooked. He looked over his shoulder. "Was it going or not, nerd?" "No," Deku said, "I don't think it was. But I didn't touch it. But maybe the bindings on the prisoners were some sort of hair trigger." Uraraka said, "And when you undid them, you started the timer." Bakugo shook his head, glaring from the kitchen. "That's first-year hero training, you dumbass. Midoriya saved 2 innocents from imprisonment, and nobody died or even suffered substantial injury. I'd say he did fine." Todoroki said, a hair too sharp to be impersonal. "Yeah, but the house sure suffered a bunch of damages, didn't it?" Bakugo snapped. He should have called it in. He's always gotta be the hero. "That's not true, Kaken," Deku said hotly, rising to his feet. "Don't pretend like you wouldn't have done the same thing." Bakugo wasn't a liar, so instead of answering he spat a few more insults at Deku and went back to cooking. "That ties in the bomb," Uraraka said. "The villain was using it to hold her next victims hostage. Hard to run away if running away causes a bomb to go off." The others gave their agreement, and Deku ran a blue string from the bomb file to the question mark in the middle of the wall. That solved, they went back to scouring all the details of the files and cross-referencing them with the details of the people with the phasing quirk that were still not crossed off the list. Uraraka was yawning when Bakugo put a plate under her nose. She blinked in surprise. It smelled delicious. She remembered the first time she'd seen him cook at the summer camp that had turned into hell years ago. She'd been impressed then, and was no less impressed now as she put some of it in her mouth. "Oh, it's so good," she said, floating down to sit on the couch in a daze of happiness. If there was one way to win her over, it was good food. It didn't hurt her opinion of him that he also shoved a plate at Deku, who took it with the most open expression of surprise they'd ever seen. Todoroki was smiling, just a gentle curve of his mouth as he sat down on the arm of the chair Deku settled down in to eat. They ate mostly in silence, Uraraka scarfing down the entire plate of food with a little more enthusiasm than necessary. "It's so good." "You don't have to act surprised," Bakugo snapped. "I can even cook, so what?" "She's complimenting you, idiot." Todoroki rolled his eyes. "With a head the size of yours, one would assume you'd know what a compliment sounded like." "Todoroki-kun," Midoriya said softly, admonishing, but he was hiding a smile behind his chopsticks. Bakugo glared at them both before shoveling more rice in his mouth. "Whatever." After lunch, Uraraka loaded up all the dishes and looked at Bakugo. He had his nose buried in a file, so she shrugged and took the dishes to the sink. "Maybe we should go interview the last few people on the list," Deku said, while Uraraka very awkwardly tried to set the dishes down in the sink without making too much noise. "Wouldn't that give away that we're onto them?" Bakugo looked doubtful, finally looking up from his file as Uraraka rejoined him on the couch, jostling him slightly as she settled back in. "It might be worth it, if we can eliminate anyone else. We've been going at it all day and haven't gotten anyone else crossed off." Deku rubbed his eyes, yawning. "It's frustrating, slamming our heads into the wall over and over when it isn't moving." Bakugo grunted, chewing on a pen as he scowled at the wall some more. Todoroki tilted his head. "Perhaps we should investigate the crime scenes again. We focused primarily on the body. Maybe we need to look at the bigger picture." "That's a good idea. Especially the building we used for the gala. It's so big I'm sure we missed something," Uraraka said, standing up again. She felt much more energized with a more direct goal ahead of her. "I want to check out around the alley," Bakugo said, reluctantly agreeing with Todoroki. "I've been wondering why the villain picked that one, instead of somewhere else." "Okay then, let's split up," Deku said, jumping to his feet. "Kakin and I can go to the alley, while you two go to the gala house." There was a noticeable lull in conversation at that suggestion. Todoroki and Deku seemed to be having a conversation with their eyes. "Why the F would I want to go anywhere with you?" Bakugo demanded, because for all that he'd grown, he and Deku still got along about as well as cats and fleas. "It's just simple, Kakin. Todoroki and Uraraka want to go to the gala crime scene. You and I can check out the alley. It'll save us time, and we can meet back here after." Deku reasoned. "The sooner we solve this, the better, right? It would be a waste of time for all of us to go to both places." Midoriya, "This, right," Todoroki said slowly, seeming only half in on whatever plan Deku had begun hatching. Bakugo was still bristled and hostile, but he couldn't think of an excuse that didn't simply involve the words, "But I want to go with Uraraka," so he found himself grinding his teeth. "But let's go then," Deku said, while Uraraka looked stunned by the turn of events. Bakugo glanced at Uraraka. She was looking at him, eyes searching, expectant. He felt a flash of something dangerous in his chest and turned away. "Yeah, I'm coming. Meet back here at 6. 6 sounds good," Todoroki said. "Good luck." Bakugo flipped him off. "Just to be safe." Uraraka felt strangely tense, following Todoroki off the train and down the street towards the sprawling mansion the gala had taken place in just a few days ago. Todoroki wasn't one for small talk, so the ride had been mostly in silence. It looked like the walk might be that way too, but then Todoroki slowed so they were walking shoulder to shoulder. "When I confessed to Midoriya, he broke a toaster," Uraraka stared at Todoroki in blatant surprise. What? I approached him in the kitchen. We were both in a hotel for a mission, and he was trying to make toast for breakfast. No, I mean, you're the one who confessed. Todoroki's mouth curled at one side. Uraraka had seen him smile genuinely before, but this little dry smirk was much more common. She hummed, tucking her hands behind her back. I always assumed he blurted out his feelings all over you. You never seemed the type. Todoroki shook his head. That's what Yaoyorozu said as well. He sighed, looking up at the cloudy sky. I don't know why you all assumed I was emotionally stunted. Just because I wasn't constantly crying, or blushing, or shouting. Uraraka laughed gently, rubbing the back of her head. I guess the people we know are all the loud kinda crazy. We forget there are other ways to express ourselves. Maybe we shouldn't ignore signs that people care for us, just because they aren't being so loudly broadcast. Todoroki said, sounding very wise. Uraraka looked at him, clueless and a little confused. We're here, he said, instead of clarifying. He turned away from her, mismatched eyes scanning the looming mansion. It almost looked unscathed on the outside. The only signs of violence were the wrappings of caution tape and all the broken windows. Let's go in, Uraraka said, eager to find something to help close the case. Todoroki lifted a banner of tape for her, and she quickly headed inside. So, you like Uraraka-chan? Deku asked bluntly, like he wasn't poking at a bloodied brick in the wall of a murder scene. Bakugo clenched his fists, stifling the explosions that went off as his entire body went from relaxed and curious to tense as a ped gun. He spun around, the heel of his boot making a crunching sound on the asphalt as he whirled on Deku. What the F did you just say to me? Deku turned, looking up at him. Sometimes, Deku looked a lot like All Might. Not physically, maybe, although he'd certainly put on the muscle and weight to potentially mimic the look, but in his eyes. Bakugo knew that their hero, their mentor, had been something more to Deku than he'd been to Bakugo. But to see it so eerily reflected in the way Deku, his childhood friend turned hated enemy turned rival, or whatever they were now, looked at him. Bakugo had to look away. He started, unsure, and then the vulnerability of what he was about to say caught up to him and he bristled like a porcupine, hardening his persona almost as clearly as Kirishima hardened his skin. It's none of your business, shitty Deku. Bakugo snarled, there are murders happening, in case you forgot. Maybe that's why I'm asking. Deku said, standing up and dusting his hands off on the legs of his hero suit. People die every day, Kaken. That's why you should never hesitate to tell them how you feel. If I want advice, I'll ask for it. Bakugo snarled, stomping further down the alleyway in an attempt to halt the conversation in its tracks. As he should have expected, Deku just dogged his heels as he always had. I know it seems like rushing in after all, it's only been a few days, Midoriya was saying, and because he never thought things through enough, Bakugo found himself spinning back around to face him again. He was talking before he registered, allowing his lips to move. You think it's only been a few days? Deku stopped, staring. I didn't know you and Uraraka saw each other often? We don't, Deku, that's what I'm effing saying. Bakugo breathed out heavily, throwing every last tiny crumble of his dignity to the wind. Nobody knew this. Kirishima didn't know it. Why was he telling Deku this? Deku, it's been 5 years. What? I started noticing Uraraka 5 years ago. Bakugo repeated, shoulders dropping. The last time Deku had seen him like that, he'd been crying over All Might. Now, he looked almost as desperate. At the sports festival, when she almost beat me. She didn't almost beat you. You destroyed her big move with one blow, Kaken. Yeah, and I had to go soak my arm in half-boiled water for the entire time after that until my next match, you FNG dumbass. Bakugo turned away again. It doesn't matter. It's effing stupid. You've liked her that long? I think I'm in love with her. Bakugo said, and then put a glove against his lips, covering his mouth. That wasn't supposed to have come out. That wasn't supposed to have been said. He hadn't even known that was true until he'd let the words fall out. I know. Deku said, after a long moment. How do you know? It was supposed to come out scathing. It sounded more desperate. Bakugo had never hated himself or Deku more than he did at that moment, and he couldn't even say for sure it was hatred. Because you look at her like she hung the stars every time she's not looking. Deku grinned, and you just thought, well, she could have with her quirk. How the F? Because I know you, Kakin. Deku shook his head. I've always known you. I may not notice everything all the time, but this is something big. I think I knew before you said. I just never took the time to really notice and process it. Bakugo put his head against the wall and sighed, closing his eyes. Don't even tell her, okay? Don't. I won't. Deku said, but you should. Maybe, Bakugo said, quiet as he'd ever been. Deku didn't touch him. Didn't hug him, or clap him on the shoulder or back like he would have if Bakugo were Ida, or Kirishima. He just nodded and moved on. Bakugo didn't say thank you, but he didn't really think he needed to. Uraraka was crouched down, frowning at a footprint in the shattered glass of a window near the back of the mansion, trying to determine if it was a clue of some kind, or just another mark left by heroes as they fled the falling building. She doubted it was a clue, but she wanted to be thorough. I don't think this is working either. Todoroki said, we aren't forensic analysts. We don't even know what we're looking for. Uraraka sighed, blowing her bangs out of her face and sitting back on her heels. I know, but I don't know what else to do. We don't have any leads. Todoroki shrugged, looking deep in thought. He glanced back over his shoulder. Let's go look at that skylight again, he said, seeming to have thought of an idea. Uraraka stood up and followed as he made his way through the long hallway towards the main entrance hall. They had to pick their way past expensive broken vases and dying flowers. Uraraka paused, slowly picking up a wilting pink rose, and shook her head with a sad sigh. What a waste. Todoroki was standing beside one of the tall, twisting marble pillars that supported the ceiling. Uraraka watched him frown up at the hole, and then take a long, deep breath. I'm going to coat the entire room in a really, really thin layer of frost. Maybe we'll be able to find some fingerprints or something. Uraraka's mouth fell open in surprise. Oh wow. That's really creative, Todoroki-kun. Todoroki nodded. Should I start on the floor or ceiling? Try this pillar first, just to see if you can do it. Uraraka said, stepping back a bit as Todoroki put the tips of his fingers against the cool marble. He seemed to have to concentrate really hard, the corner of his mouth turning white with frost as he gently trailed his fingers around the pillar. The spread of frost was soft, halting, and tentative, but it gradually began to cover more and more surface area, spreading upwards and coating the whole thing. Nothing was revealed. I don't know if my idea is going to work. Todoroki said, that's as light as I can get it, but I don't even really see anything down here, where there should be fingerprints. Uraraka hummed, tapping herself on the cheek and rising off the floor to get a better look. Todoroki watched her float upwards with curious eyes. No, I think you're right. I don't see anyth. She trailed off, going tense all over as her eyes flickered to the skylight again. A shadow. She'd seen a shadow, being cast into the building, not out of it. Todoroki, Uraraka said. His eyebrows twitched, picking up the change in her tone. And then she didn't say anything else. She kicked off the pillar, shooting through the skylight and wincing as a shard of glass scratched her thigh through her suit. Someone was about to jump off the roof. Someone with dark hair and a small stature. Someone hanging around a crime scene. She released her quirk, remembered the past years of training she'd had with Gunhead, and sprinted for the suspect. The girl jumped, clearly leaping for the lamppost nearby to parkour her way down to the ground, so Uraraka jumped after her, a knee driving into her spine and a hand wrapping around her forearms, pulling them back and grappling. Get off! Shouted the girl. We're both going to die, you idiot! Uraraka snorted. Falling hadn't scared her in years. She activated her quirk and they slowed to a stop, the girl screaming and struggling all the while. She released her quirk a moment later, driving the villain into the ground and staying on her back. Who are you? None of your business, Fatus. Uraraka shoved her, digging her knee a little harder into the spot between the villain's shoulders. She was scowling, she could feel, and she had a distant thought that All Might had always told them to smile when they were being heroes. She didn't feel like smiling. I'm going to ask you again. Did you kill Hatsume, Tetsu, and Momoma Nido? What do you think? The girl snarled, thrashing about. Uraraka shifted her weight to pin her more firmly, but a thought nagged at the back of her mind. Something wasn't right. She couldn't figure out what it was. Uraraka! Todoroki's boots came into view, startlingly white against the green of the grass that Uraraka was scowling at. She looked up. Is this them? Uraraka chewed on her lip. They were snooping around on top of the building. They match Bakuga's physical descriptions as well. Todoroki knelt down, handcuffing the girl with a set of hero-grade H&D CFFS that he pulled from one of his pouches. The persistent error message popped up in the back of Uraraka's mind again, but she couldn't figure out what was wrong. Did you kill those people? Uraraka demanded as she got off her captive. Because if you didn't, you're going to go away for some sick psychopath of a person, and people are going to keep dying. You have to tell the truth. The girl spat in Uraraka's face. She felt the spit hit her and winced, stepping back to wipe it off. We should call the police. At the very least, she's a suspect. Todoroki said, holding the girl by the chain between the H&D CFFS. He flexed his arm and lifted her to her feet. The girl grunted, stumbling and glaring at them both. She looked a little like Jairu, with her choppy dark hair and slim build. Uraraka frowned again, but obediently took out her phone. Tsuragami promised a car on the way, with a Hero SERT just to be safe, and Uraraka nodded even though he couldn't see her. The car pulled up not even a full minute later, with sirens blaring loudly. Koji Kuda stepped out of the car, waving. A little bird landed on his head and he smiled. They ushered the villain forward, and Uraraka realized what was wrong. No! She screamed, grabbing Todoroki and pulling. Todoroki let go of his grip on the H&D CFFS, but it didn't matter. The villain was no longer in them. She was grinning. Sadistic and terrifying, her entire hand outstretched for Kuda. Uraraka slammed a hand into the girl's back, screaming desperately for Kuda to get away. Her quirk sent the villain up into the sky, but it was too late. It was all too late. Uraraka watched the villain's hand pass straight into Kuda's chest. She watched her own quirk send the girl upwards, and almost in slow motion watched the way the girl's hand dragged upwards, through Kuda's throat, through his head. He blinked slowly, and blood trickled down from one of his eyes. The next second, it spilled from his ears. His mouth opened, and his hand tried to reach for his own chest. Todoroki caught him before he hit the ground. Uraraka felt her own chest constricting, fear making her choke as she looked up. She didn't want to let the villain down. The psychopath could float into space and die. The officers that had arrived with Kuda were a mess of noise. One of them dropped to his side, trying to start compressions that wouldn't help. The other was calling for backup, shouting orders into a radio. Uraraka watched the villain turn into a tiny dot in the sky, her eyes stinging. "Uravity," one of the officers was saying, shaking her. "We have to arrest her." Uraraka shook her head, a tremor racing through her as she essayed in a breath she desperately needed. What was she doing? She released her quirk, moving just a little down the sidewalk. The villain came hurtling back into view, and Uraraka slapped her, hard, reactivating her quirk just before she hit the ground. She released it again. The officers told her to keep it up, hold her in place without touching her too much. Eraserhead was on his way. Uraraka did what she was told, not turning around to see the scene unfolding behind her. The villain screamed curses and thrashed about, and Uraraka kept carefully away, only touching for the briefest of moments when she needed to reactivate her quirk. She wasn't sure if it were hours or minutes when Eraserhead showed up. He took in the scene in one quick sweep, and then stepped up beside Uravity. He put a gentle hand in the middle of her back. "Drop her," he said, his voice low and calm. Uraraka dropped her. Eraserhead kept his eyes on the girl as she got into the car. Without blinking, he swept his hand from Uraraka's back to the top of her head, ruffling her hair. "Meet us there." She nodded, not trusting her voice. Eraserhead got into the back of the car, and the officers drove away. At some point, an emergency vehicle had arrived. Kuda was gone. All that was left to show what had happened was a smear of his blood on the sidewalk and Todoroki's hand. Todoroki didn't appear shaken, but then, he'd always had a good poker face. He looked at Uraraka, and she saw in his eyes that he was horrified. "We need to find Bakugo and Deku," she said, and her voice was so much steadier than she was. He nodded. Uraraka pulled out her phone. Deku cried. Bakugo didn't say anything, but his silence was telling enough. Uraraka held Deku's hand, and Deku held onto Todoroki's arm, and they watched as Kuda's parents were brought into the station. When they left, Kuda's dad was crying, and his mom was shaking so violently Uraraka wondered if she'd shatter in a million pieces. Todoroki looked up at the clock. "It's late. We need to eat." "The place across the street is still open," Bakugo said. "We can go there." Aiza, Eraserhead sounded like he wanted to say something to me. "Yes," Uraraka said. "He asked me to meet him here." Todoroki and Bakugo nodded, and fell back against the wall. Bakugo crossed his arms, and then uncrossed them when he saw that Todoroki had done the same thing. Deku sniffled, but murmured that he wasn't hungry anyways. Another hour passed. Eraserhead appeared, his goggles around his neck and eyes red. He spotted them instantly and approached. "Have you eaten?" Deku shook his head. The others just looked at their old teacher. Aizawa sighed, and jerked his head. "I'm going to say just a few things. You're going to listen. Then you're going to go get some food in you, and go home." Not even Bakugo said a word. "What happened today was not the fault of any of you," Aizawa said. "In fact, if you hadn't been at that stupid mansion, more people would have died. You saved lives today. Sometimes you can't save them all. But you did something good today." He reached out and put his hand on Uraraka's head again. She looked up at him with big, slightly teary eyes, and he sighed. "It doesn't feel that way. It probably won't ever. But you did something good, kid." Present Mike arrived then, his flashy black car pulling up in front of the doors. He got out and Aizawa waved at him. "The villain is in a 3-foot block cement prison. Her quirk is too unstable to escape. It's over." He looked at them all carefully. "I'm on duty. I have to go. Don't forget to eat." They all nodded. "Thanks, Zawa," Bakugo muttered, and Aizawa's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "You're good heroes." With that, Aizawa left, climbing into the passenger's seat of Present Mick's car and driving away. They moved across the street to the cafe that was still open. It was the same cafe they'd gone to the first day they'd been on the case. Deku claimed the table they'd sat at that day, settling into his chair. He looked around quickly before gently kissing Todoroki on the mouth, seeming to melt a little. When Todoroki pulled away, Deku smiled softly. Uraraka looked up when a strawberry cupcake was set on the table in front of her, her eyes wide. Bakugo shrugged, but didn't say anything besides, "They're making your drink now." He ate something chocolate and sticky. Deku picked at a muffin. Todoroki drank the tallest cup of mint tea Uraraka had ever seen. It was very quiet. After, they walked to the train station. All around them was the hustle and bustle of people getting off work, returning to their families. They sat in a semi-empty car of the train. Deku and Todoroki got off first, waving goodbye from the platform as Bakugo and Uraraka rode the train another 2 stops. They stopped in front of Uraraka's apartment. Bakugo looked at her. In the setting light of the sun, her hero suit had splashes or orange and red that turned it into a painting of blooming flowers. Though her face was sad, her eyes held a strength and determination that Bakugo had seen from the very beginning. "You're pretty," he said, and then glared down at the sidewalk hard. "So are you," she said. Her lips curled up at the sides, first smile he'd seen since he met back up with her in the afternoon. Effendi not." Bakugo snorted, not looking at her for fear of what he would do. But he couldn't keep his eyes away. He looked at her again. She was still smiling, something soft and unsure. He wanted to touch her lips, with his own but also with his fingers, trace the shape of her mouth until he couldn't ever forget it. She stepped closer, and his hands clenched at his sides. His grenades made a soft noise against his belt as he shifted them. She never took her eyes off his face, so he didn't either. Her hands came up, And he could have set the world on fire with the power they gave him as they gently touched his shoulders, slipping up his neck, looping around. She was so close. She had freckles in her eyes, golden flecks amidst a sea of the warmest brown. He started, watched the way her eyelashes lowered, casting shadows over her pink cheeks. She was so pink. So warm. She kissed him, and he didn't realize he was empty until she filled him up, pouring everything that hadn't been said before into wordless whispers against his mouth. His hands came up, settling around her back. The grenades forced her a little bit closer, but there was nothing crude about it, nothing desperate. It was just her and him. "Why did you do that?" he asked her when she stepped back. "Because I wanted to," Uraraka said, and smiled again. "You always tell me to take what I want." Bakugo felt his cheeks redden. "Me?" She laughed then, a soft and echoing sound that made Bakugo stand straighter, made his stomach untangle and his heart thud away in his chest. "Good night, Bakugo." He wanted to give her something in return, but he felt like everything he had, he'd already give to her. Did she know? Did she know how much she meant to him? But she couldn't. And it was too soon on her end for him to say it. "Good night, angel face." She beamed at him, and he watched her until she closed the door and walked away. He asked her to coffee the next morning. He swallowed all his pride and opened himself up, making himself vulnerable, and asked her to go get coffee with him. She said no. "Sorry. I've got the morning shift at the agency. I get off at 6. Dinner?" He stared at the text. He didn't work today, he was off. They said he needed a day to recover and wouldn't budge no matter how much he argued. So he had the time for dinner. But dinner? Where was he going to take her to dinner? Coffee was easy, he knew what she liked so he knew where to go. Dinner was so much more complicated. "Sounds good. I'll meet you at your apartment at 7. He stared some more at his phone and then looked up and stared at himself in the mirror. Where was he going to take her? He backed out of the text messages and hesitated. Deku's name was right below Uraraka's. He could ask what Uraraka liked. Deku would know. Like hell he could ask. Bakugo snorted, closing the messaging app. He tucked the phone into the pocket of his sweatpants and stood up, not bothering to put a shirt on as he left his bedroom and moved back into the living room. He and Kirishima had mostly taken down the crime wall, there were just a few strings and pictures left up. He ignored them, instead staring at the contents of his fridge. And then the pantry. She'd really liked his cooking. And if he got to hear her make those noises she'd made again, this time when it felt like he was allowed to appreciate them. He gripped the pantry door and tried not to think too hard about Uraraka and noises, lest he get distracted. Then his phone pinged again. She likes shagiaki. Unknown number, but the frog emoji wasn't hard to decode. He frowned, wondering how and when Tsuyu had found his number. Whatever. He could cook shagiaki. He sent the message, and then frowned and hastily sent, "Thanks," after, worried for some reason. Like he cared what the hell Tsuyu thought of him. He slammed the pantry door out of principle, and Kirishima poked his head out of the bedroom, rubbing one eye. He'd clearly just woken up, his hair down around his ears instead of up in his ridiculous spikes. "Do you want to come shopping with me?" Bakugo snapped, "I gotta get sheet for dinner. And you can get more of your shitty gummies." Kirishima brightened immediately, nodding. "Let me get dressed and we can go." The store wasn't crowded when they walked in, which was nice, because Bakugo felt prickly and on edge. He and Kirishima had gone incognito, because neither wanted to deal with fans at the moment, so he was wearing jeans, a red hoodie, and sunglasses with a snapback. Kirishima had his hair in a messy bun and was dressed like an idiot, in Bakugo's opinion, but at least hopefully nobody would recognize them. They grabbed a basket and started to move through the aisles. "What's for dinner?" Kirishima asked and then frowned. "Wait, today is Wednesday. I'm headed to Denki's tonight, so we don't have to cook. I'm cooking for Uraraka." Bakugo mumbled, bracing for the unwelcome blast of cheer that his roommate and best friend was sure to throw his way. Kirishima just stopped, his hand hovering over a sugary cereal that Bakugo absolutely loathed. He turned his eyes to Bakugo and Bakugo stared back. Whatever Kirishima saw, it seemed to stop the excitement in its tracks. Instead, he just smiled. A genuine, sharp-toothed little grin. Good for you, man. I know you used to think she was super hot. She is. Bakugu snapped without thinking. Shut up, we're not doing this, we aren't girls. Talking about girls is super manly. Kirishima protested. You listen to me talk about girls all the time. It's manly. Bakugu snorted, moving further down the aisle and picking up some bread. Not for tonight, but maybe later he could make Uraraka breakfast. If she stayed over one night, or something. He tried to will down the blush that threatened to hit him at that thought and forcefully thought of anything else. Does she know you like her? Is this a real date? Kirishima asked, trying and failing to sound casual instead of excited. Bakugu's jaw ached as he ground his teeth. If he didn't start hanging out with different people, his molars were going to be flat as hell by the time he was 30. I don't know. She kissed me yesterday, so I hope she thinks I like her. Bakugu said, trying and failing to sound like he didn't care. That was the wrong thing to say. Kirishima made a noise somewhere between a pterodactyl and a lawnmower, appearing in front of Bakugu like he'd teleported. Bakugu tried to shove past and got a rocky shoulder to the face for his troubles. You what? Kirishima shrieked, and Bakugu hissed a threat on his giantilus at him. The peaceful shopping trip was less peaceful after that. Bakugu pondered killing himself with a head of garlic, and only barely managed to refrain. He had a date tonight. That was something to look forward to. Uraraka was screaming in her bedroom at 6:30, her super suit on the floor but nothing but a towel around her body. Tsuyu appeared in the doorway as if summoned, her head ped to the side. Are you okay, Ochako Karo? Uraraka gestured angrily around her room, and Tsuyu leveled a dry look at the skirts and blouses and t-shirts and shorts thrown haphazardly over every surface. Oh, you're panicking. It's easy for you. Tsuyu, you and your girlfriend have been together since middle school. What the hell do I wear for a date with Bakugu? She raked her hands through her hair, and then hurriedly straightened it back into its neat little bob. Clothing, probably, unless you're anticipating a different beginning to the night than I was. Tsuyu said sarcastically, but she came into Uraraka's bedroom, shutting the door behind her. What has you freaking out? You've been there all week, why should tonight be different? Because I want to look nice. Uraraka said helplessly, I want him to think I look nice. Does Bakugu notice stuff like that? Tsuyu asked, but she kept scanning Uraraka's floor before moving to her closet. She gently nudged Uraraka, guiding her to sit on the bed, and went back to looking for clothes for her friend. Uraraka sat on the edge of the bed and fiddled with her fingers. I think so. Tsuyu nodded and stared around some more. This was not her area of expertise. Sit there. Don't move. Uraraka looked nervously at the clock, but nodded. Tsuyu moved out of the room into the kitchen and dialed a number on her phone. Tsu-chan? Hello. It's been a while. Hello, Yamamo. Tsuyu said, I need assistance. Ochako has a date with Bakugu tonight and doesn't know what to wear. Yaoyorozu went to answer, sounding breathless and excited, but suddenly it was Jairu's voice on the phone. Tell her the black skirt with the tank top I gave her for Christmas. Jairu said, and the boots Mina gave her. Tsuyu croaked a thank you, listening briefly to Yaoyorozu gush over true love before she said her goodbyes and hung up. She returned to Uraraka and relayed the message. Uraraka looked confused for a moment and then turned red. The boots Mina gave me? Uraraka glanced at her closet. Their heels though, I hardly ever. That's what Kyuka and Yamamo recommended. Tsuyu said, shrugging. If you don't want to take their advice. Karo. No, I'll do it. Uraraka hopped to her feet, towel miraculously staying in place, and Tsuyu nodded. Good luck. Tsuyu said, I'm going to Habuko-chan's house. Uraraka didn't seem to hear her, too busy mumbling a strange kind of pep talk to herself. Tsuyu chuckled, leaving her friend's room and hoping for the best. At 7:01, Bakugu found himself standing outside of Uraraka's door. He had on a nice gray Henley and a pair of tight dark jeans. He had dinner all ready to be prepared, and he thought he was confident in whatever the night would throw his way. And then Uraraka Ochako stepped outside her door in a date outfit picked out by Jairu, and everything he thought he knew fell apart right before his eyes. Uraraka Ochako was wearing a tight, high-waisted black skirt that cut off so much higher than her school uniform ever had. She didn't have tights on either, which meant she had miles of soft, unmarked bare skin until he reached her little-heeled boots. Her shirt was also tight, and though it wasn't cut scandalously low, it clung to her in all the right places, and his heart had already flown out of his chest at the speed of sound for how good she looked. Her eyes looked molten. Her lips were red. He wanted to kiss them so bad, he thought his knees might collapse if he didn't. He quickly stepped back. "You look good." He managed, as if that conveyed half of what he was thinking at all. "Thank you," Uraraka said, sounding breathless. He looked at her again, and she looked a little nervous. He felt his mouth quirk at the side. She seemed to be watching it, so he gave her a genuine smile even though his nerves felt electrified. "I was gonna..." But Kogu didn't have a stutter or a stammer. "That was even Deku, what the hell?" He cleared his throat aggressively and tried again. "I'm making dinner at my place. It's shagiyaki. That good?" "I love shagiyaki," Uraraka said, eyes lighting up, and just like that he saw the girl he'd had feeling for since high school take over again, and he relaxed a little. "Cool," he said, and they started the quick walk to his apartment. Kirishima was leaving as they arrived, and he did a double take and then blatantly stared at Uraraka. Bakugu wanted to hit him. As it were, he just shouldered Kirishima out of the way and kicked open his front door. "Make yourself comfortable, angel face. Dinner will be ready in like 15 minutes. Bakuga didn't miss the way the nickname made her cheeks turn pink and her lips quirk into a smile. He also didn't miss the way she settled onto the couch, skirt sliding up her thighs. He forced himself to focus on cooking. He might cut a finger off otherwise. Or set something on fire. "Ooh," Uraraka said, and he risked a look over his shoulder as he set about cooking. She was bent over at Kirishima's side of the shelving unit and he fumbled everything in his hands, catching it just in time for him to glance back at him. "You have little big planet." Bakugo shrugged. "Yeah, I wanted a multiplayer game that wasn't competitive. He's a sore loser sometimes. We've also got Mario Kart, and Smash Brothers, and a couple others." Uraraka's eyes sparkled and she looked intrigued, so he said, "We can play something if you want." "That would be awesome." He finished cooking as she moved around his living room, looking at all the things she hadn't had a chance to look at when they were working the case. She loved the hero figurines on the counter that he insisted belonged to Kirishima, they did not, and seemed awed by his bookshelf. Somewhere between him moving into the kitchen and her getting comfortable, she'd lost the shoes, so her soft footsteps made almost no sound. He put their meals on plates and moved towards her. "Dinner?" She eagerly took hers, valiantly ignoring her growling stomach as she settled back on the couch. He took a seat beside her and passed her a pair of chopsticks. They ate in comfortable silence, interrupted occasionally by Uraraka's praise for his cooking and Bakugu mumbling deflections. She set her plate down first, which was an accomplishment given how fast Bakugu could eat, and turned to him, chatting away about some villain she'd taken down today that had tried to steal a puppy from the local pet store. Bakugu finished eating slower than usual, enraptured by the way she spoke, and then he set his plate on the coffee table beside hers. He turned on Smash Brothers, and the comfortable silence quickly dissolved into shouting and cursing. He liked hearing Uraraka curse. Her bubbly demeanor often made him forget how sharp and combative she really was. Then she threw an elbow in his chest in real life, and while he was stunned she had Kirby Beach slap Bowser right off the stage. He gaped at her, hands itching to explode something, and she smiled at him. "Beach, I'll kill you," he threatened, shoving her to the side as he started a new game. She laughed and he loved her. They were relatively well matched in terms of skill at the game, he could admit, so the next match was longer. When he finally got her where he knew he'd win, he suddenly couldn't see the screen. She'd stood up, bouncing in front of him, and he snarled, standing up as well and pushing her aside. They jostled each other for a while, until he knocked the controller out of her hands. She shrieked, and instead of diving for the controller, she snatched at his. He held her at arm's reach, until she put all 5 fingertips against the side of his face and he felt his feet come off the ground. "Hey," he complained, jamming the buttons, but she just giggled, tugging him back down by the sleeve and reaching for the controller again. He knocked her character off screen and she shrieked again, stomping her food. Bakugo started to laugh, and she glared at him before pushing her hands together. He thumped onto the couch and kept laughing. She stuck out her tongue. He surged forward, every intention being to bite her tongue to make her stop sticking it out. Then he froze, realizing what he'd done as his mouth pushed against hers in a bruising kiss. He went to pull back, but she melted against him, letting his momentum carry her back on the couch until he was over her. Her arms wound up, fingers scratching through his hair, and he shuddered. The kiss turned sweet as he tilted his head, tasting his food on her lips, and then it went dirty again as she opened her mouth beneath his, sliding her tongue along his, a soft noise at the back of her throat. He shifted, moving her further onto the couch. One of her legs bent, knee up by his hip, and he shivered again. He slid his hand along her bare leg as she dragged her teeth along his bottom lip, and they both made noises. She pushed him up and he went, scared he'd pushed her too far, but she just shoved him so he was sitting on the couch properly before climbing into his lap. The sight of her straddling him in that mini skirt and tight red tank top had his jeans feeling too tight. F dash, he mumbled, against her lips as she sealed their mouths together again. He gripped her hip with one hand, fingers holding her steady, and slid the other up her back, pulling her closer. Uraraka. Kacchako. She whispered, call me by my name, Katsuki. He ummed, and she shivered under his wandering hands. Kacchako, you're being really FNDCC right now, so if you don't want dash, she bit his earlobe, and his hips jerked, words abruptly forgotten. He grabbed a handful of her hair, jerking her head back, and dragged his tongue up her neck. Hey hell, you're gorgeous? Kacchako whimpered, rolling her hips, and the last threads of Bakugo's admittedly frayed self-control deteriorated. He dragged their mouths together again, sliding a hand up her thigh, fingertips edging under her skirt, and she whispered his name against his cheek. His fingers brushed something that definitely was not cotton, and he tangled his fingers in the fabric at her hip, reaching to pull, when both of their phones started ringing loudly. He almost didn't stop. But Uraraka reached for her phone, sitting on the edge of the couch. For a moment he saw her prepare to throw it across the room, but then she stopped. She put a stilling hand on his chest. Katsuki, she said, it's the Hosu police station. He blinked at her, not quite thinking with the correct head, and then focused. What? She answered it and he leaned close, pressing his cheek to hers as he listened. Uravity, we need you to come in right away. Came the growly voice of Tsuragami, and everywhere between them that had been superheated moments before turned cold and afraid. There's been another incident. Uraraka would have been the last to arrive at the crime scene, but Bakugo insisted on going with her back to her apartment. If there was another incident, he said, then it wasn't safe for her to be going alone. She was so shaken by the words that had come over her cell phone, she didn't disagree. It made her especially sick to her stomach that the scene of the crime was a cute little apartment building, for some reason. Dark alleys were one thing. They were conditioned to believe that creepy little alleyways always held dark secrets. But as Uraraka walked up to the door of the apartment building, she couldn't help but think that a door painted bright baby blue could never hold nefarious scenes on the other side. Brace yourself, cheeks. Deku said it was bad. Bakugo said quietly, nudging open the already cracked door. Deku had been right. It was bad. It was the worst thing Uraraka had ever seen. She tried to take it all in, but the details only came to her in pieces as her brain refused to acknowledge the scene in front of her. It began with a turned-over kitchen table. There was a torn tablecloth across it, halfway fallen off. A vase filled with pink carnations was thrown back, shattered on the floor. The flowers were trampled. There was ceramic everywhere from the vase but also from shattered dishes. There were chocolate-covered strawberries all over the cheap carpet. A date night? Uraraka's brain supplied, unhelpfully. The walls were relatively clean. There was a message scrawled across one in the hallway, but Uraraka couldn't make out what it said from the doorway. The carpet was red. But not red. It was also brown in some places, black in others. No, it was off-white, a cream color, really. It was just soaked completely through with blood. Blood that was coming from the bodies. The corpses. The corpses of two of her best friends. She felt herself start to shake. Bakugo gripped her forearm, but when she looked at him, she wasn't sure if he was holding her steady or trying to steady himself. She had never seen Hagakure so clearly before. She was wearing a skirt, something pretty with a green floral pattern, and a pink sweater. She had a bow in her hair and fake nails on, and most of her body and face were clearly outlined in the dark, vivid scarlet of her lifeblood. There was a gaping hole in her chest, where her heart should have been. Lying so close to her, he was partially on top of her, was Ojiro. He must have been trying to shield her from whatever happened. He was in a cozy, coffee-colored sweater and jeans. He also had a hole in his chest. Someone was breathing too loudly. It was a shrill noise, in and out and in and out and in and out and out and out and out and out and out. Todoroki's hand came up and slapped her. Uraraka stumbled, shocked, and realized it had been her, breathing like that. She blinked at him owlishly, her jaw hanging open, her head too light. He stared back at her. She breathed. Bakugo bowed up like a cobra, and snarled. "What the f do you think you're doing, hitting her?" "He had to do the same thing to me, Kakken," Deku said quietly. He was standing in the hallway, staring at the wall. "Well, F you." Bakugo growled, "Don't effing touch her again." Todoroki nodded curtly. Then he began listing off facts. Uraraka heard them and absorbed them, and didn't really understand why she seemed to be so calm now. They died yesterday afternoon. Approximately the same time as Kacchako. Todoroki said, all very clinical and reserved. If Uraraka didn't know him as well as she did, she wouldn't have noticed the tremor in his voice. This, as well as the pattern of escalating to another victim every time they kill, leads the detectives to believe that whoever did this was working in tandem with Nanami, whom we captured yesterday. How did they get in? Bakugo demanded, and take down Ojiro? The guy could kick anyone's but in close combat. I don't know how he was beaten, Deku said from the hallway, but I think Ojiro probably let the killer in. He was kind. If the killer asked to use his phone, or asked for a bowl of sugar, whatever it was, Ojiro would have tried to help out. Bakugo made a scratchy noise in the back of his throat, the meaning of which was lost on the others in the room. What does the message say? Uraraka managed, tearing her eyes forcibly from the corpse of a girl she'd once shared a dorm with. They'd had sleepovers. Hagakure had painted her nails more times than Uraraka could remember. Don't think about it. It's a lot messier than the other two messages, Deku said, but it says that we're next. What? Uraraka said, already moving towards the hallway, while Bakugo scoffed so harshly Todoroki stepped away from him. Her entire body felt cold. There were 4 of them. The next number of victims was supposed to be 4. Could the killer really be targeting them? The wall had just 2 words written there. It was blood, but that hardly surprised Uraraka. She stared. You're next. Does it mean us, like us? Uraraka asked. Us 4 heroes? What else could it mean? Todoroki asked, joining them. The entire body lingered around Deku, like he needed the closeness. Deku leaned against him, just their arms touching, and they both seemed to relax slightly. It could mean the detectives or cops. Uraraka said, I mean, nobody knows we're working this case, right? While it wasn't announced, everyone at our agencies and everyone we've told has clear knowledge of the 4 of us working this case. Todoroki said, we shouldn't take this lightly. Take it lightly? Bakugo's eyes flashed, and Uraraka could feel the anger and frustration and raw, unrestrained horror coming off of his tense body in waves. How the f could we take this lightly, shitstain? People we knew in high school, people we FING grew up with, are dead, and now they're threatening to come after us. Bakugo lifted his gloved hands and 2 loud explosions went off, crackling around his fingers. I hope they try. Todoroki exhaled, and smoke poured off his tongue. It seemed he agreed. We should warn our families, Deku said quickly, and the people we live with. Oh God, Tsuchan just left. Uraraka shrieked, ripping her cell phone from her belt pouches and shooting out a text. Kirishima too. Bakugo bumped her with his elbow, already texting his roommate to just stay with Kaminari for a while or something. She hoped he would be safe there. Tsuyu was going to stay with her agency again. After alerting everyone they could think of, they found themselves standing in the Hell's Cape silently. None of them could seem to make the first move to look for clues or evidence. Uraraka still wanted to vomit. She couldn't stop stealing glances at the way Ojiro's bruised, calloused fingers were clutching at Hagikure's hand, fingers intertwined. Holding, desperate for that last second of contact. It would have hurt so bad. Then Bakugo grabbed her by the shoulders and roughly turned her around. "My stupid FNG mother won't answer the phone," he said, his voice like stone on gravel. Deku's head whipped up from staring at the blood smears on the floor. "Your mom answers on the second ring. Every time. Like she's waiting by the phone. She's never missed a call from us, you." Bakugo turned his flaming eyes on his oldest friend, and for once in the last decade and a half he didn't bite. "I know. That. What do I? Let's go see her. We can check it out," Uraraka said, slipping her hand into his. His gloves were damp against her palm, designed to let him sweat. She gripped his fingers tight anyways. He didn't pull away. Todoroki pulled out a set of keys. "I'll drive." Todoroki's car was the most expensive ride Uraraka had ever sat in, and she couldn't even appreciate it. She was in the back seat with Bakugo, who reflexively sucked between squeezing her hand too hard and almost letting go. He dialed his mom's phone number a dozen more times as he barked directions at Todoroki, but she didn't pick up. Bakugo's fear was palpable. They reached his house, and Uraraka felt her eyes straining to pick out any tiny detail that might mean danger. It all seemed normal. There was a sidewalk leading up to a door, and the door was shut. The yard looked peaceful and normal. There were purple flowers growing in pots on either side of the door, and they looked neat and tidy, if a little underwatered. Uraraka let herself hope that Bakugo was overreacting, that maybe his mother had just forgotten her phone for once. But as they drew closer, parking in the empty driveway, Uraraka felt her hopes start to burn away. There were fractures in the door, cracks along one side. Bakugo tore away from the group, up the sidewalk and steps before Todoroki had even shut the car off. He reached the door and stopped, and an explosion went off from his hands, carefully contained in the curl of his fist. "They broke in!" he shouted, and then he shoved open the door and stepped inside. Whatever he saw, it wasn't good. Uraraka and Deku sprinted up the sidewalk, Todoroki only half a step behind and on the phone with the police. Bakugo was tearing through his house, racing from room to room, screaming for his mother. "Mom!" he shouted, the sound tearing from his throat so raw and genuine with fear that it physically hurt. "Mom! You've got to be here!" Deku grabbed Bakugo as he shot by again. His gloved hand closed tightly around Bakugo's upper arm and Bakugo spun around, shoving an explosion into Deku's face. Deku flinched back, dodging, but a scorch mark still burned along his cheek. "Kaken! Stop it! She isn't here!" "Let go of me, Deku!" Bakugo snarled. "She is here. She had nowhere else to be. I have to find her." "She isn't here!" Deku shouted. "You have to stop." Bakugo lashed out again, flipping Deku over his shoulder in that characteristic move Deku used to use on him. Deku grunted as he hit the ground, and swept Bakugo's legs out from under him. Bakugo snarled, lunging, and the temperature dropped in the room as Todoroki stepped into the house, hanging up his cell phone. Before Todoroki could escalate anything further, Uraraka stepped into the tiny space between Bakugo and Midoriya. She was so close, she could watch the way Bakugo's eyes were reddening, watch how his eyelashes dampened as he fought back tears. He stopped moving, staring at her, his expression confused and lost and terrified. "The killer has my mom," he said in a broken voice. "I have to find her." "We will," Uraraka said quietly, not touching him for fear of setting him off. "We're going to find her, and she's going to be fine. Okay?" "Yeah." Bakugo's face closed off. "What the hell do you know, round face?" Uraraka blinked at the hostility, but she knew better than to take it personally. "Bakugo, don't do that. I'm trying to help you." "Yeah, well, you can take your help and shove it up your fat FNG, but," Bakugo screamed, his words like venom, and then Deku's phone started to ring. It was a cheery pop song, incredibly unlike the ringtone they'd heard earlier when it was the police station calling. Bakugo's nose wrinkled, his scowl increasing tenfold. Are you FING 5 years old still, Deku? Why do you have that sheet as her ringtone still? Hello, Mom. Deku answered the phone from his position on the floor, ignoring Bakugo. Why, Kakin is here, but why are you crying? Mom, what's going on? The other 3 heroes crowded closer, trying to listen in on the call. It was because of that they all heard Inko Midoriya's sobbing voice on the other side of the phone beg for Deku to turn the phone on speaker. He did. His hand was shaking. He put the phone on the carpet, before his too strong hand shattered it. His knuckles were white where they gripped his knees. Hello kids, it's me. Inko Midoriya hiccuped on her tears, and Uraraka felt a solid, freezing feeling of dread begin to fill her up. I'm so sorry. Mom, just tell us what's going on. Deku said, a fear in his voice Uraraka hadn't heard since high school. Another voice cut across Mrs. Midoriya's response, and Deku's fists started to shake. Bakugo, beside him, reached out and gripped his shoulder. It was a display of camaraderie Uraraka would never have believed possible. She felt the icy feeling wrap itself tightly around her heart. It was hard to breathe. Who is in the room with you, Deku? Uraraka didn't recognize that voice. But it was cold. Chilling. Someone terrible. Ground Zero, Shuto, and Uravity. Deku said when the rest of the room nodded. They can all hear you. Who is this? You know who this is, came the reply. The question is, if you'll find me before I grab 2 more important people to you. Mama Midoriya and the blonde beach are just half of the equation, after all. Where the F are you? Bakugo snarled, tell us or I'll kill you. Find me if you can. All 4 of them started to shout, talking over one another, panicked and young and afraid. Midoriya was crying. Bakugo's voice sounded like gravel in a blender. Todoroki's hands shook when he leaned closer to the phone. Tell me where the F you are, you piece of shit. Who are your targets? Is Bakugo-san alive? Where are you? Mom, are you okay? There was no response, except the slightly muted sound of Inko Midoriya sobbing, somewhere a little ways away from the cell phone. Then that got abruptly cut off, the noise of a grunt replacing it. Then the line went dead. Uraraka actually left the house first, when the cops showed up. Midoriya and Bakugo were somehow straddling the line of frozen and doing all too much. Bakugo had started tracking his mother's phone with his, and Midoriya called someone who apparently was no help, because Midoriya hung up immediately after and almost broke his phone. We got a 911 call of a break-in? The cop in the lead flashed his badge. Uraraka put her hands on her hips, bracelets clinking against her belt. It's escalated. There have been at least 2 kidnappings, she said, letting the Uravity voice come out of her fully. She felt like she was torn, reluctantly relieved that she knew her family was safely hidden away and horrified because Midoriya's and Bakugo's mothers were missing. One of which was stolen from here. I'm going to give you full descriptions. You need to send out patrol cars immediately. The victims have limited time, and the villain is on the move to capture at least 2 more people. We aren't sure who. The cop looked incredibly overwhelmed, but Uravity was a well-known and well-liked hero. He listened carefully to her descriptions, writing down everything she said, and as she watched him return to the car and immediately relay her instructions over the radio. Did you tell them to start looking? Midoriya asked, appearing beside her with the sound of crackling that sometimes came with his power. She looked at him. Of course, they're sending out more officers. Shuto called his dad. Endeavor is sending out all his interns and anyone who works under him. Midoriya was trembling, but clearly trying to not show it. Uraraka decided not to comment. That's good. They're declaring a citywide emergency and locking everything down. Shoto said from the doorway. Everyone is encouraged to go home and stay home. The cop returned, looking a bit intimidated to be staring down 3 of the most up-and-coming heroes. We're sending out everyone we can spare. There was an incident downtown. Incident? All 3 heroes interrupted and crowded the cop. He looked even more uncomfortable, eyes going wider. We aren't sure exactly what happened, but there was a minor explosion. We found Present Mike unconscious on the scene. Take us to where they took him. The order came from Bakugo. He was standing in the doorway behind Todoroki, but shouldered the other hero aside as he stepped forward. Uraraka didn't disagree with the order, but the cold tone of his voice was so unlike him that it made her stomach tight. She tried to meet his eyes, but they were focused on the cop. I don't know where. Well, find out. Bakugo snarled. Now. Go. The cop scrambled away, rushing back to his car even though the radio at his hip was no doubt functional. Midoriya looked like he wanted to protest to Bakugo's rough treatment, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he gripped Todoroki's hand tightly in his own and took several deep, calming breaths. Uraraka stepped towards Bakugo and he didn't move away. In fact, he stepped closer, his hand coming up and gripping her forearm. She looked at him, surprised, and he met her gaze full on. His eyes looked like little frozen pools of blood, wide and afraid. Then they steadied, and he put his forehead to hers, breathing slowly. His breath smelled like the dinner they'd shared. It was warm on her face. Gonna need you, Uravity, he said quietly. You can help. Uraraka dislodged his glove from her arm and instead gripped his hands. You've got me. Gonna need Kacchako too. He admitted even softer. His eyes flickered back up to hers, vulnerable. You've got me, Uraraka repeated. She took the risk and kissed him gently. He shivered. When she turned around a moment later, having heard the cop car door slam shut, Deku was staring at her with the softest expression he'd ever given her. Todoroki nodded. The cop rushed up, glanced at all of them with even more wariness, and gestured back to the cop car. I've got the address. And you're in luck. He just woke up. They tore into a hospital like crazy people. The logical part of Uraraka's mind told her that they shouldn't be running like that they were going to scare people. The slightly crazed look in Bakugo's eyes made the logical part of her whimper and die, though, so she followed his heavy-booted steps up the outside stairs and through the doors. Hisashi was standing in the lobby. He had a wrap of bandages around his head. He was dressed, but only in civilian clothes, and he looked only a little scuffed up. Kids. The usual laughter wasn't in his voice as he turned towards them, though his eyes brightened. I mean, heroes. Present Mike, what happened? Midoriya demanded. We think it's connected to our case. The case we all thought was closed? Hisashi clenched his fist. I really hope not. Well, what the f happened? Bakugo asked, his voice too loud in the quiet hospital, but nobody seemed to even bat an eye. Ground Zero and Present Mike in the same room? Things were bound to be loud. We were walking home, Hisashi said. We'd gone to a cat cafe. Then the alley blew up and there was dust everywhere. We went back to back, did the usual warnings, I cleared the dust. We've been doing this for so long, you know? We have habits. His voice broke as he spoke next, then something started ringing in my head. I thought I got bad migraines from my quirk, but it was like everything was screaming all at once. I hit the ground. They tell me they haven't found Aizawa. They haven't found Aizawa? Hisashi shook his head, and his striking green eyes locked on the four of them. But we're about to, aren't we? Bakugo clenched his fists. UFING know we are. We're already sanctioned. Come with us. Present Mike lifted a bag and pulled his familiar speaker collar from within. I'm right behind you. The room they were in was cold. Not just air conditioner cold, but absolutely freezing. If he could see at all, he was sure he'd see his breathing making little puffs of air in front of his mouth on every exhale. He suspected they were being kept in a freezer of some kind. Is she awake yet? Aizawa asked, his voice rough and scratching. He was shivering. That was a good thing. It would be bad if he stopped shivering. And no. Aizawa had only met Bakugo's mother a handful of times, but she had been a snarling, violent mass of fire every time. To hear her sound so timid and beaten was not good. He took a deep breath, trying to ignore the way it rasped out of him, and tried to think. The villain was clever, he'd give them that. Not only had she gotten the drop on him, but she'd also managed to get a metal headband of sorts around his head. It was locked shut tight and kept him from being able to see or use his quirk. He was a little surprised they weren't already dead, to be honest. Surprised that the mothers that were locked up with him weren't dead, at least. They weren't heroes. They had never attended UA. It kind of confused him, their part in all this. Okay, Aizawa said, and tried to channel some of Hizashi's cheer into his voice, because it was clear that Mitsuki was terrified out of her mind. Maybe she needed the happy-go-lucky sounding hopefulness, even if he wasn't sure he believed it himself. We're going to be okay. The most important thing to do is stay calm and stay warm. Please bring Inko-san over here. We need to sit close together, so we don't freeze. There were dragging noises as Mitsuki shuffled closer. Aizawa would have moved himself towards the other two, but his hands were manacled together and then chained to the ceiling. He didn't have much space to do anything other than sit there with his hands above his head. He fought against instinct and didn't pull away when she collapsed beside him, her shoulder against his. He felt Inko's head fall across his thigh and took a calming breath. The cut on his palm throbbed slightly. He curled his fingers tighter, wincing. We'll make it out, Aizawa said. Just stay calm. Try not to cry. Mitsuki nodded, beside him. He hoped someone found them soon. Against doctor's orders, Present Mike managed to charm his way out of the hospital with several signed CDs, a signature across someone's chest, and a promise to get a nice picture of Eraserhead for a nurse's daughter. The five of them made their way to the alley where the crime occurred. The rubble and brick had been picked through and investigated already by the cops, but the forensics team had already left. Present Mike pushed his sunglasses up on top of his head and squinted at the walls, frowning. I know Eraserhead. He left some kind of sign. Bakugu paced around, his steps sharp and quick like a caged tiger. His boots scuffed pavement as he kicked stones out of the way, looking for something that might have been left behind. Midoriya jumped easily up onto one of the neighboring buildings, putting his arm around Todoroki to take him with him. Uraraka tapped her hands together, floating gently up to the top of the other building and investigating the fallen bricks and damaged structure closely. Looks like an explosion quirk, Midoriya said, but a different kind than Kakken's. I would have leveled the buildings. Bakugu said firmly, confident. They're obviously not as strong. Uraraka had to agree. There were scorch marks on the brick, but they were very small compared to the kind of damage she'd seen Bakugu inflict. The crumbling and deterioration of the crime scene was nowhere near as explosive as Bakugu could have managed, but it was dangerous all the same. She crouched down, looking for any sign of a struggle. And then she saw it at the far end of the building. The damaged building she was standing on was some kind of electronics shop. There were all kinds of wires and antennae poking out of the top. And one of the wires was ripped out. Recently, too, she suspected, because there was something caught in the ends that made her stomach swoop. Over here! She shouted, it's Eraserhead's capturing weapon. She heard the shuffle of boots landing on the roof, but hardly glanced back. She was too determined, trailing her hand along the white cloth as it trailed off in a very specific direction. Like it had been carefully unspooled, leaving a trail. I love that man, Present Mike declared, and at Bakugu's incredulous look he quickly shot finger guns and a smile. Whoops. Don't tell the presses now, got it? Whatever. Bakugu snarled. We have a direction. They jumped off the buildings with Uraraka lowering most of them down gently, and followed the capture tape as long as it would go. When it ran out, they spread out along the street. The night was dark and chilly, but the lack of people around worked in their favor. They climbed up on buildings and scrambled around places that would likely have been somewhat off-limits or at least difficult to negotiate entering. It was Todoroki who called out, hefting his hand in the air. The familiar yellow goggles made Present Mike shriek, shattering a window. He clutched them close, redoing the clasp and putting them around his neck, carefully hidden behind his speaker. They took off in the direction Todoroki found the goggles in. Bakugu found the next breadcrumb in the trail. Blood. A splatter of blood, beginning with a half-soled handprint and dragging away. Intentional, I think. He did it to himself. Bakugu said, look, that marking is too perfect. He did it on purpose. He's leading us to wherever they took him. Uraraka said, he's so smart. Well duh. Present Mike said, let's go. They moved a little slower, scouring brick and asphalt and plaster for more blood. They weren't nearly as noticeable as the first one, just a tiny smear there, a grabbing hand there, or a cluster of droplets on a light post. It seemed like Eraserhead had been trying to look like he was putting up a struggle, without actually struggling too much. With all 5 of them looking so intently, they managed to follow the path. They moved quickly and quietly, only really speaking when they found something, weaving their way around buildings and scaling walls when needed. They reached the edge of the city. There was a single building left in their path. They hid in the alley across the street. There weren't any clear signs, no more blood, no more dropped pieces of Aizawa's hero costume. Nothing, except that this was their last chance before the villain left the city. It wasn't a fancy building by any means. In fact, it was almost sad-looking. It had been some kind of fast food place once. A cheap and easy burger place, if the decrepit signs were to be believed. But it had long since been abandoned. It was dark and lonely-looking. Not at all what one would expect from a villain's hideout. Midoriya suddenly staggered, putting a hand on his chest as he fell to one knee. Todoroki's arms immediately lit up with fire and ice, his eyes searching wildly for a foe as he stood protectively in front of his boyfriend. But Midoriya shook his head, gripping Todoroki's belt and standing back up. Not an enemy. Just a gut feeling. Bakuga's eyes narrowed, focusing on Deku with a question he didn't seem to want to ask. Is it? Midoriya nodded, his expression going deadly and cold. For a face so usually promising sunshine and happiness, the scary look worked surprisingly well. His green eyes were like poison, his kind smile a dangerous grimace. All Might is in there too. Uraraka wanted to ask how he knew, but she didn't. Midoriya had always had a close relationship with their teacher. Closer than anyone even. She wasn't surprised he could sense their old mentor, even outside a building. Let's go then. Bakugo snarled. They're clearly in there. The BS30 has our moms. And that's 4. That's 4 if 8 people, we need to hurry. I will call for reinforcements. It would be wiser to wait, Todoroki suggested, but Bakugo and Deku both rounded on him. Our moms are in there, they said together, and Todoroki's fingers spasmed on the phone as his other hand reached up, gently touching his scar. Right? I will call, but we can go in now. Proceed with caution, Present Mike said. This isn't a training exercise anymore, kiddos. Uraraka had been studying the building. She'd noticed an open window towards the rear of the building. Some of us should go in the front. Attempt a negotiation. The rest can sneak in through there. She tilted her head towards what she had found. If we sneak in, there's less of a chance for the hostages to get hurt, right? That's right. Present Mike agreed. I'll go talk to the villain. Deku, Ground Zero, you two come with me. Shoto and Uravity will sneak around back. Those are our moms. We should, Bakugo started, his voice little more than a snarl, but Present Mike held up one gloved hand, frowning intensely. Your moms, All Might and my best friend. That's why we're negotiating. We'll do something stupid if we go back there. Uravity and Shoto are lighter on their feet anyways. We have to trust them. Bakugo turned his eyes on Uraraka, and she felt something strike her hard in the chest. He was begging. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were begging her, trusting her, vulnerable to her. She nodded. He turned back to present Mike. Fine. They split up. Deku grabbed Shoto's hand, squeezing it briefly, and Todoroki nodded. The trio of negotiators moved quickly into the street, approaching the building openly, hands up to show they meant no harm. The effect was lessened slightly by the crackle of lightning along Deku's spine and the shower of sparks from Bakugo's hands, but they approached slowly nonetheless. Uraraka touched Todoroki gently, lessening their gravity only a little bit as she led the way in the opposite direction. She saw a more hidden path, looping around between other buildings to come up on the abandoned fast food place from behind. They traveled quickly and lightly, feet making almost no sound. Todoroki's breathing was cool on the back of her neck as they hid behind a dumpster, watching carefully from their new position. A girl that looked identical to the one they'd locked up stepped out to talk. She had something, maybe a small phone, in her hand, and dried blood soaking her sleeves. Uraraka felt herself fight back, shivering, praying that the hostages were still okay, that the blood was from something else. Where the F are our moms, you stupid ugly beach? Bakugo snarled, and Present Mike put a hand on his shoulder. You mean the nasty blonde one? And the fat one? The villain pet her head, dark hair swinging. In my freezer. Uraraka wanted to stay and hear the rest, but that was more than enough. She tapped Todoroki and he lit little flames under his feet, propelling them into the air with as careful a direction as he could muster. They held onto the gutters of the building, maneuvering carefully, and then made the quick move across the street to the back of the villain hideout before dropping to the sidewalk. Todoroki nodded to show her the coast was clear, and she climbed quickly through the window. Inside, the floor was covered in dust and grime, except for trails of footprints. Everything from when the place had been a fast food establishment was left just where it was. There were old containers of grease, thrown up against the walls and leaking. The grills still existed, though it was clear they hadn't been used in a long time. Tables and chairs were haphazardly stacked everywhere, which Uraraka was actually grateful for. She used them as cover as she quickly moved towards the kitchen area of the building, her boots sliding slightly in the grime of the floor. Todoroki followed after, his taller height and broader shoulders making it a little more difficult for him to get through the window and more difficult to crouch behind the tables for cover, but he managed well enough. He stayed just a few steps behind Uraraka, putting his boots where hers had landed, silently making their way through the building. They were lucky it wasn't large. Uraraka found the metal door to the freezer easily enough and glanced back. Todoroki nodded, posting up on the wall beside the door, ready to attack if anyone came through that wasn't supposed to. Uraraka counted to 3 in a breathy whisper, just barely loud enough to be heard. She jerked the door open, sidestepping quickly, but there was no attack from within. Shoto, came a desperate, sobbing voice, and Todoroki flinched instinctively as arms came around his neck, holding him tightly. Uraraka went into a defensive stance, but there was no need. The speckled red and white hair was familiar. She'd once baked cookies for Todoroki's birthday, and delivered them to their school dorms. Fuyumi? Todoroki sounded shocked, and Uraraka didn't blame him. They hadn't even known Fuyumi was kidnapped. I knew you'd save us. They took my phone, but I knew you'd find me, she said, sounding painfully proud, and Uraraka realized they'd only gotten a text from her saying she was fine. Uraraka peered into the freezer, her stomach dropping as her brain automatically counted what she had to physically count herself. All Might looking half dead. He was unconscious, half his face beaten black and blue and his entire body bound tightly with rope. Mitsuki, with mascara down her face and blue lips from the chill. Inko, who was awake but staring fearfully, looking like a hunted rabbit. Izawa, chained to the wall, a metal brace around the top of his head and blood on his hand. And Fuyumi. That was 5 people. That was 5 people. We've been tricked. They're going to kill somewhere else. Someone else. Uraraka said, Shoto, get the chains off Izawa. I'll get all my... We have to move fast. Todoroki gently pushed his sister aside, quickly rushing into the freezer. A tiny bit of fire on the ice-cold metal around Izawa's eyes had it falling to pieces, shattering from temperature change. He set to work on the manacles while Uraraka ripped apart the ropes holding All Might's shivering body. Inko and Mitsuki climbed to their feet, holding each other tightly, shaking. Lead them out the back door. You can protect them if something happens to come that way. I'll go out front. Aizawa-sensei? You okay to walk? Aizawa rolled his wrist and stood up. He looked worst of them all, eyes rimmed with frost and bloodshot, but he only smirked. You know me better than that, Uravity. Come on. Todoroki melted the lock off the back door and skirted the others out, supporting All Might under one arm as the ex-hero limped. Uraraka and Aizawa burst through the front doors, startling everyone involved in the talks. Oh well, the villain said, dropping the phone. Aizawa had her in a hold that she would never be able to escape from. My job is done anyways. Level 4 isn't bad. That's 10 murders. What? Bakugo roared, his eyes as ablaze as his hands, but Uraraka held up her hand and he stopped. Your moms are fine. So is Ome. Todoroki took them out the back. Uraraka said, not daring to take her glare off of the villain girl that Aizawa had restrained. Somewhere else in the city, a murder is happening right now. Might have already happened, the villain said, My little sister is pretty good at what she does, you know. We captured your sister. Aizawa said. Your twin? Yes. Not that one, she said, the secret one. She just got out of the hospital. And she was said. Where is she? Tell us now, it might help you. Present Mike said. The villain shrugged. Sure. More the merrier. She can kill you too. She lifted her hand and pointed. At one of the largest buildings in the entire city. It was some kind of corporate office. 17 floors. So many rooms. Halfway across town. The headquarters of the Ingenium Hero Association. Hirarika flicked her gaze. Trump. Brown eyes met red and he started moving. She held out her hand, and Bakugu's glove slapped into it within the beat of her heart. As soon as the weightless effect took over, he blasted the sidewalk under them. They hurtled through the air, faster and faster as they rose higher, letting Bakugu make bigger blasts. Thank you, he whispered into her hair. She clutched him tighter. They were moving so quickly she almost didn't hear it. Deku ran along below them, a streak of lightning matching their pace. Todoroki and the others had been left behind, but they didn't have time to bring them. They moved faster than almost anyone at the moment. Deku reached the building a few seconds before them, rushing into the doors. Bakugu blasted them out of the air, and Uraraka let their gravity return as their boots met pavement. They booked it into the air. The lobby was scattered. Deku was already briefing the present sidekicks of the situation, telling them to evacuate as many people as possible, that there was a villain present that might very well be hiding in the building. Some stranger came in a little bit ago. Tiny girl with dark hair. She was in a wheelchair being pushed by Red Riot and had a bunch of other heroes with her, so we let them go. Bakugu turned on the petite, pink-haired girl that reported it so quickly, the girl dropped her phone. Where are they? They went up the elevator. Cameras are over here, someone shouted from the desk. We saw her enter the 10th floor. Just a few minutes ago. Deku took to the winding staircase, apologizing loudly as he knocked people out of his way. Uraraka slapped Bakugu's palm again, holding his hand as he launched them into the air with an explosion that sent the girl who'd told him her information sprawling to the floor. 1, 2, 3, 4, Bakugu counted out loud. Hey idiot, you better not be effing dead or I'll kill you. He blasted them sideways. They landed on the 10th floor, and stared at the 2 hallways branching off. There were so many places to check. It would take forever. They didn't have this kind of time. Deku appeared as they both moved towards different areas. His chest was heaving, but he looked unscathed. I'll go right. You go left. I tried to call Ida, but he didn't respond. Bakuga didn't respond, nodding shortly to show he'd heard Deku before sprinting off down the hallway to the left. Search as much as you can. If you find anything, call us before you engage, if you can. Deku nodded, so she started looking at the few doors that made up the middle of the floor, before the hallways. Bakuga blasted open door after door. The 10th floor evidently wasn't being used for much, currently, because most were empty offices, or classroom-type spaces. He could barely hear over the pounding of his heart in his ears. Not again, not again, he wasn't about to start thinking Kirishima was dead. Not again. He blew the handle off the last door in the hallway and snarled as it, too, came up empty. Uraraka, bright pink and soft and round, appeared at the end of the hallway as he turned around. Deku found something. Come on. He caught her hand as she outstretched it instinctively. They ran together down the hall, her palm against his glove. When they reached Deku's hallway, it was to find him standing there frozen, a panic in his eyes. His arms were high above his head, but his thumb and forefinger were together, like he might try to do a flick of wind that he never typically used anymore. They rushed over, and also both froze in the doorway. Kirishima was the first one they noticed. He was between them and the girl in the wheelchair. His normally so friendly eyes were blank and empty. He had a piece of glass in his hand. It was held to his throat. Behind him, flanking him like they were ready for combat, were Tsuyu and Ida. They both held shards of glass at their own throats as well. Tsuyu's dug into the edge of her throat the slightest bit as Bakugu and Uraraka approached. They both froze. I'm upset, screamed the girl in the wheelchair. I'm tired of it. Tired of heroes, tired of quirks, tired of it. It always hurts. Hey, it's okay. Deku said, I know someone who can take your quirk away. Who? The girl asked. Eraserhead. He won't help, he hurt my sisters. He won't help anybody. He'll throw me back in the stupid hospital, again and again, where the doctors don't help. They just give me medicine that makes me sleep. We know Eraserhead, we can tell him to help. You just have to let our friends go, okay? They're my friends now. I've heard them. In my head I heard them and they're mine. She raised her hands to her own head and clutched at it, like she was holding it together physically. It hurts to be alone. So now I'm not alone. For now. I have to kill them because they're from that school. It's all wrong, you know. I deserve to go to school too. But I was too scary. She stared at them, and something about the way her eyes looked at the three of them was all wrong. It made Bakugu's stomach churn. Let them go or I'll take them from you, he snarled, unable to keep his patience any further. You can't. The girl hugged herself, her entire body trembling. It hurts. It hurts, it hurts, it hurts. What hurts? Uraraka asked, in the gentlest voice she could manage when staring at three of her best friends, her closest friends, threatening to kill themselves. My head, the girl whimpered. See. At once, Uraraka fell to her knees, clutching her head and screaming. Bakugu moved without thinking, stepping close to her, raising his arm at the girl. Kirishima stepped between them, the edge of the glass just barely drawing blood from his skin. Bakugu faltered, his breathing too fast, his eyes wide. Kirishima, you dumbass, move. He can't listen. He's too sleepy. The girl in the wheelchair sounded genuinely saddened by the fact. He can only listen to me now. Because now he's mine. I don't want to hurt him, though. He's mine, so I can't hurt him or he'll leave. He's either gotta die or stay with me forever. And no, Deku choked, you can let them go, can't you? Bakuga didn't dare move. His arm shook slightly, eyes glued to the tiny stream of red rolling down Kirishima's collarbone. Then the words rolled over him again. I can't hurt him or he'll leave. This better work. Bakugu opened his fist and let an explosion loose. Deku screamed, and Bakugu felt his hands on him, pulling him, horrified. Uraraka, on the other hand, had stopped screaming. She looked up, tears in her eyes. Bakugu watched the smoke clear, and Kirishima stood in front of him. The glass in his hand was crushed to pieces. His arms were crossed over his face, and his skin was hardened up. When he raised his head, his eyes were cleared. You're crazy, Kirishima said, and I love you so much for it, dude. Yeah, Bakugu said, his relief clear in his voice. Move. Kirishima moved quickly, ripping the glass from Tsuyu's hand and kicking Ida in the knee to knock him down at the same time. Deku, having caught on, carefully aimed a punch at his best friend's shoulder, snapping him out of it. Tsuyu was a struggle as she kept jumping around, but eventually Bakugu caught her around the waist and slammed her into the floor. The girl curled in on herself, screaming the entire time, and then she looked up. You want to know how it hurts? The wave of hatred that lashed out at them all was almost physical. Windows shattered. The heroes noticed none of it, all of them collapsing in various positions and clawing at their heads as they screamed as well. It felt like their skulls were filled with acid, melting slowly from the inside. If Bakugu could have found any concentration, he would have fired an explosion at his own head to numb the pain. But he couldn't. He could only curl into a ball, screaming, and try to make the pain stop. Distantly, in fragments, he wondered if this was it. He should have told Uraraka after all. Uraraka woke up slowly, forcing herself to open her eyes when the rest of her body tried to pull her back down into oblivion. She wasn't sure what was going on. She hadn't moved? She was pretty sure she hadn't moved. She couldn't remember telling her body to move. She became aware one piece of her at a time. Everything felt tingly, like she'd slept on it wrong and the blood was just starting to flow there again. When her eyes stopped being filled with spots and flickers, she let them focus. Bakuga's face slowly came into view. He was unconscious. His hair fell across his forehead, hiding one of his eyes. The lashes on his other eye swept down over his cheek, barely visible through his bangs that were like little blonde feathers against the angles of his face. His mouth was partially open, his lips gently parted like he'd been whispering before he fell asleep. He looked soft and unharmed. His glove was wrapped tightly around her hand. She slowly became aware that her legs were tangled with his, that in her last moments, in her agony and desperation, she had thrown herself on him and he had clutched at her as well, tangling them together so that if that pain was the time that they went out together. She felt her eyes start to well with tears, and pulled herself together. She sat up. Nothing hurt. All around her were unconscious heroes. Her friends. People she loved. All except one. Deku was standing. He was standing and his eyes were huge. She followed their line of sight, and choked on her breathing, her heart leaping into her throat. His fist was tight around the girl's throat. She was still alive, Uraraka could see it in the flicker of her eyes, but Deku was killing her. He was killing her. You're killing her, stop. Deku fell back as though she had physically pulled him. The lightning effect that was a part of his quirk vanished, like he'd completely shut it off. Uraraka lurched to her feet, her legs tingling violently, her sudden movement knocking Bakugo into consciousness. The girl in the wheelchair clutched at her throat, rasping, hacking. Then she raised a hand, and brought it down on a button that should have just made her wheelchair go. Instead, it brought the building down because of course it did. Because of course they weren't getting out of this without another explosion. Because this had all started with a bomb, why wouldn't it end with one? Deku snapped back into action. He kicked out a window, and lifted Kirishima onto his back. Ida and Tsuyu awoke as the building started to shake. Tsuyu launched herself out the window, and Ida sprinted down the side of the crumbling building. Uraraka turned, caught Bakugo's hand as the ground lurched under her feet. Bakugo pulled her towards him as a piece of the ceiling fell down behind her, crushing the villain to dust. Uraraka hit Bakugo's chest and they rolled, falling as the ground collapsed. Uraraka touched everything she could, slamming her palms against plaster and glass, brick and drywall. Her stomach rolled. Bakugo held her around her waist, clutched her to him with one arm as he used to other to blast things above and below, and they were falling, floating, bouncing around like pinballs. Blood sprayed like a firework as a twisting bit of rebar tore a wound into Bakugo's shoulder, and he shouted. He cried out in pain, but didn't let go, holding Uraraka tight as he could. Uraraka tried to say something, her eyes wide and his blood on her face, and he tried to listen. Then, a piece of the building slammed into them hard, knocking them sideways. Bakugo watched Uraraka's head slam into it and bounce, and his heart fell into his stomach. They landed on something stable and rolled. She was a dead weight in his arms, he could feel her go limp. When they finally stopped rolling, she was under him. She had blood running from her head, bruises across her pretty round cheeks. Something heavy and solid fell across his back and he fell to one elbow, barely keeping the strength to hold it up, to push it back and keep them from getting crushed. And then, all of a sudden, things were still. Including Uraraka. Damn it. You stupid round-faced F-dash. Wake up. Bakugo shouted, his voice cracking halfway through the sentence. He coughed as dust filled his lungs, drying his mouth out, and grunted as the movement sent pain lancing through his back. He wasn't someone who cried often, if at all, but just then he wanted to sob. There was a gigantic slab of concrete forcing his spine into a sharp, perfect line. He supported it, although it felt like it was driving him into the ground. Below him, Uraraka bled faintly from the corner of her mouth, and a bruise was just barely visible at the crown of her head. Bakugo could feel her breathing against his chest, the rise and fall of her body gently brushing his own. It was so quiet. Come on, Uraraka? Bakugo whispered, dropping his head to her chest and squeezing his eyes shut. Wake up. Uraraka didn't. He felt tears start to fall, dripping from his nose and chin onto the dust-covered fabric of her uniform. It was a different material than it used to be. She'd changed it sometime through their third year, saying that she wanted it to be more durable. He'd pretended not to notice that it was easier to hold on to, too. Not as slick. Her chest was rising and falling. He could feel it against his forehead. He wanted to be relieved, but the blood pooling under her head made him sick to his stomach. She wasn't conscious, and she had a serious head wound. He didn't have to be the genius he knew himself to be to know that she was in serious, serious trouble. "Uraraka," he murmured into her chest, "please, wake up, I can't get us out of here." She didn't respond. "Damn it, Uraraka?" Bakugo lifted his eyes, started at the way the always rosy glow of her cheeks was pale. Ghostly. Her hair was getting matted down with blood. At this point, he wasn't sure where his blood ended and hers began. There was so much. They were so effed. Damn it. Damn it, damn it, damn it. He gritted his teeth. His shoulder offered another wave of blood in protest, but he managed to push back the stone at his back and shift. The movement showered the both of them with grit and dust. He didn't care. He could look at her face now. "I should have told you before, but you know IFSCK at words." Bakugo muttered, "You always seem to know what I was talking about, so I never if I elaborated. Or whatever. But we aren't looking great, angel face. We're looking pretty bad." He coughed and winced when red droplets dappled the front of her uniform. "Really bad. So, in case the sheet doesn't get better, in case Deku doesn't manage to save us this time." Bakugo dipped his head down, straining his shoulders and back, feeling the grind of metal against his spine, and kissed Uraraka. "I love you, angel face," he whispered into her mouth. His vision went black, and his head fell down beside hers. Neither of them moved. Everything was still. Uraraka looked really pretty. He watched her take a sip of champagne, leaving a smear of soft pink lipstick behind, and his stomach tied itself in knots. She was wearing that orange dress from the gala, strapless, soft and pastel. It hugged her at the top, showing off the strength in her arms and the curve of her waist and chest. Her hips swayed as she set her glass down, taking Kirishima's offer of a dance. The skirt flared out at the bottom just a little to give her room to move, and she had flats on, he saw. She had always been so soft and warm. All round edges, where he was sharp and grating. All velvety cushion, where he was rigid blade. But never weak. Never fragile. She was not some china doll to be handled with fingertips and tiny touches, carefully kept preserved from harm with white gloves and tissue paper. She was not a glass vase, to be put on display but never handled. She was a firework, like the ones shining on her ears as she turned her head to look at him. She was an explosion brighter than he could ever manage. Her bright eyes met his. For 5 years, he had always looked away when she did that. When she found him watching, he'd brushed it off, ignored it. Ignored her. This time he stared back. And she smiled. His heart stuttered in his chest. "Are you going to wake up for me, idiot, or are you going to break my heart?" Bakugo blinked. And when his eyes opened back up, it was not the eerily calm dance floor and champagne flutes that he saw. It was cinnamon, sprinkled over whipped cream delicately, and a glaring Starbucks logo with water slipping down the side onto a bedside table. Hospital, his head told him as he took in the fluorescent lighting, the uncomfortable, stiff bed. The sheets that might as well have been paper. He frowned and turned his head. His entire body felt like a singular bruise, but he ignored it, scanning the room. He saw her, and a loud beeping filled the room. Uraraka looked at the heart monitor and raised a hand to her mouth, laughing behind her bandaged fingers. He felt his face heat. "Shut up, cheeks." She didn't, laughing harder, but there were tears in the corners of her eyes. She moved quickly, much quicker than he probably could have at the moment, and threw herself on top of him, arms around his neck. He felt the 4 in his arm protest as he pulled his arms up, holding her tightly. "I thought you'd gone and died, you idiot." Uraraka complained, her lips against his throat. "I thought you did first, dumbass." Bakugo retorted, ignoring the way the heart monitor was broadcasting his quick, embarrassed heart to the room. "How the f are you up before me? You looked way worse when I passed out." Uraraka turned faintly pink as she sat back, and he saw that she had her hair styled differently than usual. She raised her hand, pushing her bangs out of the way on the left side, and he saw why. She had half an undercut now, probably due to the scar that was wrapping over her ear and down the back of her head. "It was really bad. They found us, and you woke up to yell at them to heal me first." They did, but you almost bled out while they helped me. The girl who healed me is actually still sleeping it off, I think. I'm really lucky. You're something, Uraraka, Bakugo said, and pushed the thought of what he'd told her before he'd passed out of his mind. She didn't remember. It didn't matter now. Uraraka's face softened impossibly more, her head tilting as her chocolate eyes melted, but then the door burst open, and Mitsuki Bakugo came in with all the subtlety of a freight train. Katsuki, she roared, and then he was being crushed in a hug that involved a lot more hitting than most. He growled, trying to shove his mother off of him, but she clung tight. You dumbass, idiot child. Biu, I think you're killing him, Uraraka stuttered, her eyes wide and fearful. Both Katsuki and Mitsuki shot her a look. I can handle being hugged by this stupid beach, Katsuki said, just short of a growl, while his mother talked over him sharply. I'm not going to kill my hero of a son girl. Katsuki stiffened. His mom had never called him that before. Mitsuki must have noticed because she sat back, settling on the bed opposite the side Uraraka was still sitting on. Katsuki suddenly felt very awkward and uncomfortable and wasn't sure why. Katsuki, Mitsuki said, you're effing and idiotic dumbass. But I am so proud of you. She punched him in the arm, and he only had a little of time to feel relieved it wasn't the one that had been torn open by falling debris. Deku appeared, closely shadowed by Todoroki. Deku threw himself on the foot of the bed, grinning at Katsuki brightly. Todoroki just nodded. Katsuki found himself liking Todoroki more and more. Behind them, as if summoned by the sudden parade of people in Katsuki's room, Kirishima came barreling in with Kaminari, Mina, Jairu, and Momo. Katsuki opened his mouth, snarling at them all to leave him alone so he could get some goddamn sleep, but they were all completely unfazed. Deku started rapidly explaining what had happened while he'd been unconscious, Todoroki chiming in only when Deku got off track. Kirishima climbed into bed with him and laid across his legs, randomly interrupting Deku occasionally to tell Bakugo he looked like sheet. Mina left pink lipstick all over his forehead, much to his fury, and Kaminari tried to put headphones over Bakugo's ears twice, cackling. Uraraka was quiet, having been pushed to the side of the room when everyone flooded in. He met her eyes as Deku continued rambling, and she smiled at him. It seemed to say something, but he wasn't sure what. He turned back to Deku when his mother hit him. When he looked up again, Uraraka was sitting in a plush armchair, out of the way, but still very much present. Eventually, everyone was shoved out of his room by several nurses. His mother got to stay a few moments longer, but all she did was hit him on top of the head several times. As she was being pulled away by a horrified-looking nurse, she suddenly grinned at him like a lunatic. Katsuki, she said softly, that girl really likes you. Thumph that up. She's sweet. Katsuki didn't know what to say to that. Being left in silence after the roar of his friends and mother was disorienting. He felt fine. Almost perfect except the soreness. His arm was a little tender. But he felt fine. He said as much to the nurses, but they told him only his doctor could dismiss him, so he'd be there a few more hours at least. He drank the coffee. It wasn't quite as sweet as he liked it, but it was good. As he fidgeted in place after, chewing on the straw and reading and rereading the label, he went over what Deku had told him. The collapse of the building had killed the villain. There had been a large number of injuries, some severe as his own, but nobody else had died. They still weren't positive on motive, but from what could be gathered from the other two girls, it went something like this. Asuka, the girl in the wheelchair, had been born with her quirk. She'd screamed nonstop for weeks, until they managed to figure out it was her quirk that was causing her pain. She had a form of telepathy that she couldn't seem to turn off. It was incredibly powerful, often lashing out or hurting her. They'd tried everything from suppressants to tranquilizers, but nothing helped until she was almost unconscious. That was how she'd lived on heavy medications that basically shut off her brain from when she was 7 years old until 15, when she died. Probably hadn't understood what she was doing, killing them all, but her older twin sisters had bred resentment and hatred in her, until they all went on a murdering spree. The twins were imprisoned, trials to be held in the near future, but it didn't look great for them. Bakugo hoped they both rotted in a prison where they never got to see each other or anyone they loved ever again. He almost felt guilty for the thought, but then he remembered the desperate grip Ojiro had had on Hagakure's invisible fingers, and didn't care. Ida, Tsuyu, and Kirishima were fine. They'd been in some kind of trance caused by Asuka's quirk, but there didn't seem to be lingering effects. Between the three of them, they managed to keep everyone safe as possible from the explosion. They'd found Bakugo and Uraraka somewhere between the 5th and 4th floor. Apparently after falling unconscious, more of the ceiling had collapsed. He and Uraraka should have been completely crushed. They weren't quite sure why they weren't. Deku called it a miracle. Bakugo had other theories. Theories that made him spit curses and push the nurse button until they dragged the doctor in to dismiss him. He had a bag of clothes his mother had brought him, and threw on the gray tank top, jacket and jeans without much thought before running out the door. He didn't head home. He headed for the apartment building just a few blocks from his, hopping in a cab when his own feet took too long. He probably looked a bit crazy, running up the stairs as quick as he was. His entire body protested, but he kept going. 2nd floor. Last apartment by the stairs. He skidded to a halt and stared at the placard on the door. He raised his hand and knocked twice. The weight between his knock and the doorknob turning made him suddenly regret every decision that brought him to where he stood at the moment. Uraraka peeked through the crack in the door. Her eyes went wide as she took him in. He was out of breath. He probably looked gross, having come straight from the hospital. He was suddenly acutely aware of how sweaty his palms were, and how dark the circles under his eyes must be. She opened the door completely, and stood there. She was in pajamas. Pink ones with little ducks. She was so cute. She was appealing. The rubble should have crushed us. They're calling it a miracle. But I know you. I know you could have saved us. You were awake. He said. The change in Uraraka's face was subtle. Bakugo wasn't sure anyone else would have noticed the way her eyebrows twitched up, just a little, but he did. He noticed everything about her. Were you awake? Uraraka tilted her head. Her new haircut fell messy over her forehead. She probably hadn't gotten it properly cut in a particular style, but just put up with it when they'd buzzed her hair to save her. I don't. You heard what I said, Uraraka. Don't lie to me. Bakugo wanted to push forward, wanted to crowd her, to grab her face and make her look at him, tell him the truth. He'd saved the country at least twice now, but nothing felt as important as getting her to answer him. And yet he didn't move. Couldn't. Please, don't lie to me. Uraraka's expression changed vividly this time. Her eyes suddenly danced, her mouth curling up at the side in a smirk for a moment before it bloomed into a full-fledged smile. Bakugo felt like he was seeing the sky after being trapped underground for days. I woke up as you were passing out. But only for a few seconds. Did you? Bakugo's heart stuttered, and he was exceptionally glad they weren't having this conversation in the hospital room. The heart monitor beeping would have driven him crazy. I heard you. Uraraka said. I wasn't sure if you wanted me to. So I didn't say anything. But I heard you. Just the very end. Bakugo's heart stopped completely, he was pretty sure, but there was also a noise roaring in his ears, so maybe it had just sped up so much it was just one long beat. He stared at her. She smiled at him, looking supremely unconcerned. He said wisely. Did you, Uraraka finally cracked, looking awkward. If you didn't mean it. Shut the F up, Bakugo said, putting his hand on the doorframe beside her head and leaning over her. When have I ever said anything I didn't mean? You threaten to kill everyone all the time. Uraraka said, but her smile was coming back, and that was all that mattered. Maybe I mean it. No, you don't. Well, I meant that. What I said. Bakugo said, suddenly quiet and soft and everything he usually wasn't. There was silence. Bakugo dragged his eyes away from the wall to fully look at Uraraka. She was looking at him, eyes all wide and soft. Lips parted just slightly. Her breath smelled like mint toothpaste. She was staring, her breathing soft and slow. He memorized the shades of brown in her eyes and the flickers of pink in her cheeks before he slowly stepped back, dropped his eyes to the floor. You don't gotta say sheet. It's fine. Uraraka's hands fell against his shoulders. He looked at her again as they slid up his neck, brushing his jaw, cradling his face. He stared. I love you too. Uraraka said, I didn't know before, but I do now. I love you, Katsuki. Bakugo could have burnt down the entire city if it meant hearing her say that again and again, but he didn't have to. She fell against him as he tugged, pulling her close and kissing her. He went rough and fast, desperate and longing. She met him move for move as she always had, and he whispered her name into her mouth. He felt her whimper, the noise making his hands grip a little harder on her jaw, on her hip. She dragged him back into her apartment, kicking the door shut behind him before pushing him back against it. Bakugo gave a grunt of surprise at the slam of his back against hard wood, and she slipped her tongue into his mouth, tongue flicking against his teeth. Ochako dash, he started as she pulled away from his mouth, but then she pushed the zip-up hoodie from his shoulders, and all the words he knew in any language fell out of his brain. He said, wisely, and Ochako's cheeks turned impossibly red. Did you not want to? I didn't say that. Katsuki said quickly, finding his words finally, I just don't want to rush with you. I want to take my time. You took forever and a half to confess. Ochako said, and I've thought you were hot since high school. We don't have to, but I do if you want to dash. I dash. They both trailed off. Then Ochako threw her hands up in the air and huffed, exasperated. Do you want to have a see with me, Katsuki? Katsuki had never nodded so quickly in his life. Ochako laughed, a soft and joyous sound that made all the tension bleed out of his shoulders and his heart stutter happily in his chest. He reached for her, and she reached back. She reached back. Just like that, it was like all the hunger from before returned solid and pressing. She pushed him up against the door again, but with renewed confidence Katsuki flipped them, grabbing at her thighs and hefting her legs around his hips, pushing her harder against the door as he liked his way back into her mouth. Been dreaming about these thighs for years, Ochako, Katsuki whispered against her mouth. She tossed her head back, lips pressed together to muffle the noise she made in response to his words, so he started running his lips across her throat. She bared her throat more for him, whispering his name, and he smiled. He hid a hickey into her throat on principle, but kept it low enough that the high collar of her hero suit would hide it if she zipped it up. She tugged at his hair, dragging his mouth back to hers, and he let her. He would let her do anything to him, if she wanted it. He was so far gone in love with her. Her fingers were chilly against his arms, and colder against his stomach as she pushed his tank top up. She traced her fingers along his abs and he breathed against her lips, pulling back enough to glance down. You taking the shirt off or what, cheeks? Ochako arched one eyebrow, and pulled her hands away. Instead she grabbed the bottom of her pajama top and pulled it up over her head before tossing it behind her. She wasn't wearing a bra. Of course not, she'd been in pajamas. Katsuki's snark died on his tongue. God damn, you're gorgeous. He whispered, and then he pushed his face into her chest, laving his tongue along one of her breasts and grabbing the other, squeezing. Ochako whimpered, pushing into his hands and breathing out a sigh as he dragged his teeth across supple skin. He sucked his attention to the other BRT, mumbling praise. One of her hands was tangled in his hair, clutching him both closer and tugging when it became too much. The other fell to his jeans, fumbling with the button. He let her go only long enough to rip his shirt off over his head, and then he was crowding her against the door again, mouth on as much skin as he could reach and hands blazing over what he couldn't put his mouth on. Her hands skated over his skin like she was the one with the explosion quirk, burning trails wherever they touched. Katsuki was so hard in his jeans he was mildly afraid that as soon as she touched him he'd come like a teenager. He pulled himself away and glanced over his shoulder. Now. Bossy, Ochako said, taunting, and leaned back against the door. Katsuki turned an incredulous look at her. She met his eyes and slid her hands up her own body, cupping her melons and pinching her own nipples. This is my house, you know. Katsuki heard the challenge and was not afraid as he grabbed her. He hauled her bodily against him, kissing her senseless as he gripped her short hair in his hand to jerk her head back, forcing their mouths together. Ochako didn't protest, pushing back against him with as much fire and spilling out of her throat. He grabbed one of her thighs, squeezing, and lifted it to wrap around his waist. He was momentarily distracted, grinding his aching pee-pee against the warmth of her through her flimsy pajama bottoms. It was his turn to into her lips, and she returned the sound with fervor, helping him out by slinging her other leg around his hips as well. His hands fell to her round but to catch her, easily holding her against him. He jerked his hips up against her for a moment and she pushed down. It was almost good enough. But no, he wanted inside her. Humping her until he came in his jeans was never going to be enough. Instead he threw her down on the couch and then dropped to his knees before her. She looked at him through eyes turned black with longing, and he tugged her pajama shorts off too, dragging her hips to his mouth in one fluid motion. Her hands returned to his hair, tugging as she squealed. He didn't tease, never one for subtlety, as he plunged his tongue into her pee-pee with his mouth and then skinged mercilessly on her seal before laving his tongue over it hard. She bucked against his mouth and he slipped his hands to her, holding her open as he liked, and utterly ravaged her with his lips and tongue. Kacchako, she tossed her head back against the couch, biz bouncing as she squirmed from his attention. Oh please, please don't stop. Kacchako flicked his tongue over her silty again and slipped his thumb into her pee-pee, just a little. She ummed loud enough to wake the neighbors. Her thighs clenched around his head, toes curling as she came hard, trembling against his mouth. He kept going until she nudged him with one foot, pushing him back. He rocked back on his heels, knees a little sore, and rubbed a hand down the front of his jeans. He was so hard. God, he wanted her. Your turn, she said, voice a little rough as she launched herself off the couch and pushed him to the floor. She had his jeans unbuttoned and tugged down before he could even manage to sit up, shoving the coffee table out of the way. She mouthed him through his underwear as she tugged on his jeans, and one of his hands slapped up to his mouth. He bit the back of his hand, watching her tongue dart out and trace the head of his pee-pee through thin cotton. Kacchako. Oh yeah, she ummed, tugging his underwear down too and then fitting her mouth immediately over him as soon as he was free. His head hurt a little as he slammed it back into the ground, every muscle in his body straining as he fought not to buck up into her mouth. Then her gentle hand found his, dragging his hand to the back of her head and slipping his fingers into her hair. Huh. He managed not his best moment. You think I can't take it? Kacchako rolled her eyes. Give it to me, Kacchako. Kacchako had never needed to be told something twice. He tangled his fingers in her hair and lifted his hips, into her mouth. She ummed around his pee-pee, drool leaking from the corners of her mouth, and he ummed up into her wet mouth harder. God, Kacchako, he swore heatedly, you're so effing perfect. You always could take everything I gave you. Never back down, huh? He dragged her off of him by the hair, staring in awe at the pre-cum and drool making her entire face stick. Come here. Give me that FANG pages. Kacchako grinned wolfishly, her lips red and swollen and wet. She crawled over him and grabbed his soaked pee-pee with a hand, sinking onto it without hesitation. He grabbed her hips, swearing loud. His arms and torso trembled with the effort it took not to come in her right then. Then she started to bounce, fully in control of the situation. He watched her, alternating between gripping her hips hard enough to leave bruises and teasing his thumbs over her biceps or see. She seemed confident and proud until he planted his feet on the carpet behind her and started to move up into her. Then she tossed her head back and whined, chasing her pleasure as much as his. When she clenched down around him, trembling from head to toe, he gave a shout of her name and followed her over the edge, pushing up into her. She let out another whimper as she felt his pee-pee twitching inside of her. Kacchako said, letting himself drop back to the floor. You too. Uraraka said, giggling against his collarbone. Kacchako smoothed his hand over the ruffled mess that was her short haircut and tilted her face gently towards his. From his angle, he could barely manage to reach her nose, much less her mouth, but he kissed the tip of her round nose gently, then pressed another one to the crown of her head. I love you, he whispered softly as she threatened to fall asleep on his chest, sweat cooling between them. I hate both of you, Karo. Came a familiar croaky voice, and Bakugu went rigid and horrified beneath Uraraka. She jerked upright so fast she almost kneed him in the crotch. Hero instinct kicked in just in time to have him roll away, covering himself both from view and from her dangerous knees. Tsu-chan! She shrieked. I thought you were at Habuko-chan's house. Maybe you should have checked before you ruined our living room, Ochako-chan. Tsuyu complained. When she came out of her room, she had a pair of goggles on with socks stuffed in the lenses so she couldn't see. I've been permanently scarred forever. Now I have trauma I'll need to go to counseling for. Oh, if off, Froggy. Bakugo rolled his eyes as he tugged his jeans back on, no longer embarrassed so much as irritated at their golden moment being interrupted. It's Froppy, Uraraka and Tsuyu said together, and then Tsuyu continued with, and if you're going to get germs all over my living room, you could at least be polite about it after. I'll clean up, soon I promise, Uraraka said, while Bakugo snorted and mumbled insults under his breath. I am really happy for you though. Tsuyu said, you've both been so disgusting for so long. Now you're gross on the outside too. Tsuyu! Ochako cried, embarrassed, while Bakugo yelled, oh F yourself, Froxlot. I already told Ijiro-kun and Ashido-chan. Tsuyu said, grinning as slyly as she could with her tongue lolling from her mouth. They screamed almost as loud as Ochako-chan when Tsuyu! Ochako roared, leaping to her feet in Bakugo's tank top and her shorts. I'm never coming back here again. Ha! Bakugo pet his head. And where will you be going then, Cheeks? She rounded on him, aforementioned cheeks red and eyes blazing. Don't you start teasing me too, Katsuki. I'll kick your butt. You'd better. Bakugo purred, slipping an arm around her waist. He kissed her, gently, not particularly caring if Tsuyu peeked. Uraraka went soft against him. Tsuyu croaked a laugh into her palm. And Bakugo smiled.